What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni Sensei here with What If Mark Grayson Was Born in DC x Invincible Universe? DC/Invincible Crossover. Part 7. If you enjoy this type of content, please super smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. Let's dive into the rise of Invincible without further ado. Mark looked up at the sun, squinting slightly as he took a small break from moving the rest of Kara and Raven's belongings into their new house. Corey would be joining them later, once Kara had given birth. The Kent farm was a nice spot, hot under the summer sun but cooled by a gentle breeze, with vast stretches of beautiful land surrounding it. Their new home was situated about 100 meters from the main house, though it wasn't their original home that they had first built. Kara had decided it would be better to build a house that would both blend with the farm's aesthetic and offer more rooms for their growing family. Mark had given her the go-ahead with a shrug and a smile. The worker bots were nothing short of miraculous. Mark had witnessed their efficiency before, but seeing them construct a fully functional home in less than a day was truly astonishing. It made him ponder about the broader universe. If Kryptonians could achieve such feats, what wonders might other species out there be capable of? His thoughts drifted to the Viltrum Empire. What kind of technology and power did they wield? These thoughts swirled in his head like a cosmic storm until a familiar voice pulled him back to Earth. Mark. Turning around, he saw Kara descending the steps of their new home, a glass of fresh lemonade in her hand. Her smile was as radiant as the sun above. Have this, it hits the spot on days like this, she offered, extending the glass towards him. I don't get hot that easy, you know, he replied with a grin, his tone teasing. I'm sure I can rectify that, she responded with a playful glint in her eye. She stepped closer, pressing the cool glass into his hand before leaning up to kiss him. It wasn't just a kiss, it was an invasion, her tongue seeking his as it twirled in his mouth. She pulled him close, her body flush against his, the kiss deepening, turning from playful to passionate in an instant. Mark felt the warmth spreading through him, not just from the day's heat but from the fire of Kara's kiss. She pulled back with a mischievous smile, leaving him momentarily breathless. See? Now you're hot, she teased. Mark chuckled, his hand playing with a loose strand of her hair. You've got a point there, he admitted. The breeze picked up, cooling the flush on his skin. He glanced around at the completed house, and then back to Kara. This place is going to be something special, he said. Kara nodded, her gaze following his. It's already special, she replied, her hand finding his, squeezing it gently. Because we're here together. Coming out a moment later was Raven, holding Waylon in her arms, rocking him gently. Mark smiled at her, wrapping his arm around her waist. How do you like the house? It is nice, but nothing will replace the home we had, Raven said wistfully, leaning into him. Mark hummed in agreement. It would have been nice if we could have gone back there. Kara, sensing the mood, leaned into his other side, hugging him. I wish I could have seen it. Bayview sounded beautiful. It was, Mark and Raven said at the same time. The silence that followed was thick with the unspoken sorrow of Bayview's destruction. They stood there, wrapped in each other's company, enjoying the gentle breeze, until Mark's phone rang. He untangled himself from both women and pulled out his phone, glancing at the caller ID. Mom, he hadn't visited his mother since returning from the void. The last visit was vivid, his mother's tears of relief, the slap of admonishment, followed by a tight, loving embrace. She made him promise never to leave again. She took to Waylon like a duck to water, refusing to let anyone else hold him, her face lighting up. It was clear she loved her grandson. She also adored Raven, accepting her into the family, though she hadn't spared Mark a playful slap when she learned of his complicated relationship status, unintentionally marrying another woman while his girlfriend was pregnant. Mark answered the call, the smile on his face genuine but tinged with complexity. Hey Mom, he said, stepping away slightly, but his eyes stayed connected with Raven and Kara. Mark, when am I going to see you? It's been too long, his mom's voice came through the phone. I was actually planning to come by, Mark said. I need to head into the city to pick up some stuff for the house. Oh, wonderful. Are Kara, Raven, and my little grandson coming too? Nah, they need their rest. They'll be staying with Mr. and Mrs. Kent for dinner tonight, he explained. His mom sighed, I suppose. But make sure you bring pictures of Waylon. I will, Mom. He's getting bigger every day. They chatted for a few more minutes about mundane things. His mom mentioned she'd started a new gardening project, and Mark promised to help when he visited. Mark, you know I love you, right? Her voice softened. Yeah, Mom, I love you too, he replied, feeling the warmth of her love through the miles. Okay, I'll let you go. Say hello to everyone for me. Goodbye, son. Will do. Goodbye, Mom, Mark said, ending the call. He looked back at Kara and Raven, who were now watching him, their expressions curious. She wants to see us, he informed them, but I told her you guys need a break. Kara nodded. It'll be nice for you to have some time with her. Plus, we'll enjoy a quiet dinner with the Kents. Raven smiled. Give her our love. I will, Mark assured them, slipping his phone back into his pocket. Giving both of them a kiss on the lips, he then kissed Waylon on his head before shooting off into the sky and heading to Gotham. It didn't take long for Mark to arrive, but as soon as his boots hit the grimy pavement, he was reminded of why he hated this city. The air was thick with the stench of gasoline and rotting garbage, mingled with the faint metallic tang of blood. Gotham never changed. Its streets were alive with the sounds of sirens and gunshots, its alleyways teeming with opportunistic predators. He hadn't even been there 5 minutes before someone decided to test their luck. A wiry man with sunken eyes and a greasy beanie stepped out from the shadows of an alleyway, clutching a small knife that gleamed faintly under the dim streetlight. Hey, big guy, the man said, his voice dripping with false bravado. He twirled the knife like it was an extension of his arm. Wallet, phone, whatever you got. Hand it over nice and easy, and maybe you get to keep breathing. Mark raised an eyebrow, his towering frame illuminated briefly as he stepped under a flickering neon sign. He had seen this type 1,000 times before, desperate, stupid, and completely oblivious to the fact that he was picking a fight he couldn't possibly win. Mark let out a long sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly. Listen, man, Mark said, his voice calm and low, like he was addressing an unruly child. Just walk away. I'm having a decent day so far, and I'd like to keep it that way. No need for anyone to get hurt. The man chuckled nervously, clearly mistaking Mark's relaxed demeanor for weakness. Oh, I'll be the one hutting you if you don't cough up what I asked for, he snarled, lunging forward with the knife in a poorly executed attack. Mark didn't flinch. His reflexes kicked in before the man's blade even came close. He drew his hand back and delivered a casual slap to the man's face. It wasn't even close to a full-strength hit, just enough to send the mugger flying backward like a rag doll. The man's body slammed into the alley wall with a dull thud, leaving a crack in the brick and a smear of blood where his head had connected. For a moment, Mark stood there, frowning. Did I overdo it? He wasn't exactly gentle, but it wasn't meant to be fatal. He watched as the man groaned and stirred, his movements sluggish but alive. Blood dripped from his nose as he clawed at the ground, trying to get his feet under him. Next time, bring a gun, Mark shouted as the mugger scrambled to his feet, clutching his side and limping out of the alley. Mark shook his head, more annoyed than anything else. Typical Gotham. Stepping out of the alleyway, Mark adjusted his leather jacket, the city's stale air hitting him full force again. The streets were alive with activity, though it was far from welcoming. He passed a group of teenagers huddled around a flaming barrel burning some kids' collectible cards, laughing as they did so. Further down the street, a couple was arguing loudly on the steps of a condemned building. Mark kept walking, brushing past people and ignoring the constant wail of sirens that seemed to echo from every direction. Was it always this bad? He thought, frowning slightly. Sure, Gotham was never a shining beacon of peace, but Batman usually kept petty crime in check during the day. Seeing so many police cars flying by, lights blazing, felt off. Still, it wasn't his problem. Shrugging, he kept moving, heading toward the mall. That was the first stop. He needed to pick up some essentials for Kara and Raven. Then go see Mom, he reminded himself. and maybe stop by Wayland's grave after. Just thinking about it made his chest tighten a little. Being back in Gotham after nearly 2 years in Bayview felt strange. He'd grown up here, and as much as he hated the city, there were still good people in it, or at least there used to be. Lost in his thoughts, Mark barely noticed when he bumped into someone. The guy staggered slightly, then turned, trying to shove Mark. It was pointless, of course. Mark didn't budge an inch. Realizing he wasn't getting anywhere, the man settled for flipping him off instead. "Watch where you're walking, bastard," the guy snapped before stomping off. Mark glanced back, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Gotham really does have its charm. He kept moving, weaving through the crowded streets until the mall finally came into view. It stood out against the surrounding buildings, clean, polished, and probably the only structure in the district that didn't look like it had survived a war. As soon as he stepped inside, the noise hit him. The place was packed, swarming with kids just out of school. Mark glanced at the clock on the wall and sighed. Great timing, idiot. There wasn't much he could do about it now, though. He just needed to get in, grab what he came for, and get out. No drama, no distractions. Gus Grimsby wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, but it didn't help. The sweat kept coming, streaming down his face and neck like a leaky faucet. His shirt clung to his body, soaked through, and his pants weren't faring any better. It didn't matter whether it was freezing cold or scorching hot. Since he'd taken that cocktail, this was his new normal. His body seemed to work overtime, his metabolism burning like a furnace no matter what. But he didn't mind. It was worth it. Every drop of sweat was a small price to pay for the strength surging through his body. His muscles were like steel cables now, corded and unyielding. He could punch through solid concrete without a second thought, lift a car above his head if he put his mind to it. He was faster, stronger, and tougher than any man had the right to be. And the best part? It hadn't cost him a dime. Well, almost. Gus wasn't always like this. A month ago, he was an amateur boxer, decent in the ring but stuck in the middle tiers, grinding for wins and scraping by. He might have had a shot at going pro one day, until he made the mistake of winning a fight he was supposed to lose. The bookies didn't take kindly to losing their cut, and Gus paid for it. They'd broken his arms, his legs, and left him to rot in a filthy alleyway. That night, when he thought it was all over, was when he met him. Dr. Juice. The man had appeared out of nowhere, dressed in a lab coat that looked out of place in Gotham's grimy underbelly. Juice had made Gus an offer that night, a chance to heal his body, not just back to its original state, but to something better. Stronger. Faster. The kind of strength Gus could only dream about. He didn't hesitate. Revenge was the first thing on his mind. Revenge on the bookies who'd broken him, on the corrupt system that kept him down, and maybe even on the world itself. And after that, Gus would return to boxing. He wouldn't just win, he'd dominate. World champion material. The cocktail worked like magic. Within weeks, Gus's shattered bones healed, his muscles grew, and his stamina surged. He felt invincible. But there was a catch. There's always a catch. Dr. Juice wasn't in it for charity. The good doctor had his own problems, namely, a desperate need for funding. Gus and a dozen other recruits had been roped into helping Juice get the money he needed. They weren't just hired muscle, they were test subjects, prototypes for whatever Juice was cooking up in his lab, though from what he'd been told none got the same cocktail he did. The orders were clear: no banks, too risky. The cops, or worse, one of the Bat family, would shut them down before they even got the vault open. The next best thing? Gotham City Mall. Plenty of cash registers to raid, jewelry stores to clean out, and enough hostages to keep the cops busy while they made their escape. It was the perfect target. Now, Gus stood in an abandoned building across the street from the mall, sweat dripping onto the cracked concrete floor. Around him were a dozen other men, all armed, all dressed in plain clothes, just hats and sunglasses to obscure their faces. They looked like any other group of guys, inconspicuous enough not to attract attention. For now. All right, listen up, Gus growled, his raspy voice cutting through the tension. He stepped forward, glaring at the men with bloodshot eyes. We go in, we hit hard, and we get out fast. Grab as much cash as you can, maybe a few shiny things if you're quick about it. Don't waste time, and don't get greedy. One of the men, a tall guy with a sneer plastered across his face, snapped the magazine into his pistol and stood to his full height. "And who the hell put you in charge?" he spat, clearly unimpressed. Gus didn't even blink. He turned, pulled his arm back, and slammed his fist into the nearest wall. The old plaster and brick crumbled instantly, a gaping hole left behind. The sound echoed through the building, and the man stumbled back, his bravado replaced with wide-eyed fear. "I put myself in charge," Gus hissed, his dry voice scraping like sandpaper. He glared at each man in turn, daring them to challenge him. "Anyone else got a problem?" The room fell silent. A few of the men shook their heads, and one even took a step back, muttering something under his breath. "Good," Gus said, straightening up. He reached for the large bottle strapped to his back, unscrewed the cap, and took a long drink. The water helped, but only a little. He was always thirsty now, a constant, unquenchable thirst that gnawed at him. Probably another side effect of Juice's cocktail, but Gus didn't care. 5 minutes, he barked, capping the bottle and tossing it aside. "Get your shit together. When we move fast." As the men scrambled to check their weapons and gear, Gus stood by the window, staring out at them all. People streamed in and out, oblivious to what was about to happen. It didn't take long for the rest of the crew to get ready. They moved out in pairs, leaving the building at 2-minute intervals to avoid drawing attention. Gus had planned it this way: spread out, hit multiple stores at once, and grab as much loot as they could before the cops even had time to set up a perimeter. The plan wasn't elegant, but it didn't need to be. Smash, grab, and get out. That's what mattered. They'd also agreed to take hostages, enough to keep the police at bay and buy them more time. Gus didn't like the idea of killing people if it could be avoided, but he wasn't about to lose sleep over it either. No one in this shithole of a city was innocent. Fear worked. Fear kept people quiet and compliant. That's all he needed. Larry, one of the other goons, had promised he'd keep any cops busy if they showed up early. Gus wasn't sure what to make of him. The guy was skinny, borderline scrawny, and his arms were wrapped in bandages from wrist to elbow, like he was hiding something. Gus had wanted to ask about it, but he figured whatever juice had pumped into him must have been good enough to make up for the lack of muscle. Besides, Gus didn't need every man to be a heavy hitter. He just needed bodies willing to pull the trigger if things went sideways. By the time the last pair had filtered into the mall, Gus was already in position. His target was one of the larger jewelry stores near the center. It had thick glass counters lined with rings, watches, and necklaces that he knew would fetch a fortune once fenced. The security was light, 2 unarmed guards who looked more like glorified mall cops than anything else. They weren't going to be a problem. Gus adjusted his hat, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and drew his gun, not because he needed it, but because it made things easier. Most people didn't argue when you pointed a gun at them. He stepped through the entrance, raised the weapon, and fired a shot into the ceiling. The crack of the gun was like a thunderclap, silencing the chatter and laughter of shoppers. "Get on the ground. Now," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the store. The reaction was immediate. Customers screamed and dropped to the floor, some cowering behind display cases, while others pressed their hands over their heads. A few panicked and tried to run for the exits. Gus didn't give them the chance. He spotted one guy bolting toward the door and grabbed him by the back of his shirt, hauling him off his feet like he weighed nothing. With a grunt, Gus threw him across the store. The man's body slammed into a glass display case, shattering it on impact and sending shards flying in every direction. He groaned but didn't move after that. "Anyone moves, and I kill you." Gus snarled, leveling his gun at the rest of the hostages. His voice came out dry and rasping, like sandpaper, but it didn't matter. The fear in their eyes told him everything he needed to know. They weren't going to fight back. Behind him, 2 of his men were already moving through the store, sweeping the aisles and clearing out the cash registers. One of them, a stocky guy named Rick, smashed open a glass counter with the butt of his shotgun, scooping jewelry into a duffel bag as fast as he could. The other, a nervous-looking kid barely out of his teens, kept his gun trained on the hostages, his hands trembling. Gus made a mental note to keep an eye on the kid. Nervous guys made mistakes. Mistakes got people killed. Out in the mall, He could already hear the sounds of chaos spreading. Screams, breaking glass, the sharp reports of gunfire from one of the other teams. The plan was working. The mall security was overwhelmed, and the police wouldn't know what hit them. Gus turned back to the hostages, scanning the crowd for any signs of trouble. He didn't see any heroes, no one trying to be brave or stupid. Good. He didn't need the hassle. Fill the bags and move fast. Gus barked over his shoulder. We've got 10 minutes before this place is crawling with cops. Larry's voice crackled over the radio a second later. Got eyes on the first responders, he said. 2 cars just pulled up outside. No SWAT yet, just uniforms. Gus grinned. Keep 'em busy, Larry. Oh, I will, Larry replied, and even through the static, Gus could hear the smile in his voice. Gus didn't know what Larry was planning, but he didn't have time to worry about it. He'd done his part. Now it was up to the others to stick to the plan and not screw this up. He crouched behind one of the counters, keeping his gun raised as he glanced at his watch. 8 minutes left. Almost there, he thought. Just hold it together. Mark made his way through the crowd, towering over most of the people around him. Kids were running everywhere, shouting to each other, shoving friends, and occasionally bumping into strangers without so much as a glance back. He gritted his teeth as one particularly loud group of teens almost tripped over themselves while rushing past him. This is why I shop online, he thought bitterly. The first store on his list was a boutique that Kara had recommended, or rather, insisted on. He couldn't remember the name, something French-sounding, but he knew what he needed to grab for her: maternity clothes and a few cute outfits for the baby. That was her word, not his. After that, Raven's tea, he thought, moving toward the upper floor. She'd given him a whole list of obscure blends that she swore by. He didn't get it, but he wasn't going to argue. As he climbed the escalator, he caught himself scanning the mall. It was automatic, a habit from years of living in a city. Gotham taught you to keep your head on a swivel. Most people looked harmless: parents wrangling kids, couples holding hands, tired retail workers trying to make it through their shifts. But there were always a few that stood out. A group of guys in hoodies loitering near the food court, their eyes darting around like they were casing the place. A woman standing too close to a distracted shopper, her hand hovering near the man's open backpack. Even a few homeless people hanging around. Even one of the poor district's nicest places has people like them begging. Mark didn't stop. He wasn't a hero here, not today. Someone else could deal with it. He stepped off the escalator and headed toward the boutique. A bright sign in the window declared a sale, and the display mannequins were dressed in clothes that screamed chic suburban mom. Mark sighed. Why couldn't she just pick something online? Pushing the door open, he was immediately greeted by a cheery sales associate who looked like she'd been waiting all day to pounce on a customer. Hi there. Can I help you find anything today? She chirped. Mark plastered on a polite smile. Yeah, I'm looking for some baby clothes. My wife, my partner, she's pregnant, he explained awkwardly. The woman's eyes lit up, and Mark knew he wasn't getting out of here quickly. Great. This is going to take forever, he thought, already bracing himself for the ordeal. Though it seemed Mark wouldn't need to worry about doing any more shopping as 2 gunmen burst into the store, firing off bullets into the ceiling and causing a commotion. Get down on the ground. Move and I'll bust a cap off in you. The first man barked, waving his pistol wildly as if that made him more threatening. The second guy was a little more proactive, vaulting over the counter and immediately pistol-whipping the cashier. The poor guy hit the ground hard, groaning as he clutched his head. People screamed. Some bolted for the exits, only to stop in their tracks when more gunmen appeared outside. Most, however, hit the floor like sacks of potatoes. Mark, meanwhile, was lying flat on his stomach, looking less like a victim and more like a man who had just collapsed from sheer exhaustion. His head rested against the tile floor as he let out a long, defeated sigh. Of course this happens, he thought. I can't just buy some underwear without getting dragged into a hostage situation. No, that would be too easy. His cheek was pressed against the cool floor as he slowly glanced to the side. A woman a few feet away was staring at him with wide, panicked eyes. Are you okay? She whispered. Oh yeah, just peachy, Mark muttered back. Before she could respond, one of the gunmen stomped over and pointed his gun at them. "You too. Shut up." Mark immediately slapped a hand over his mouth and made an exaggerated zipping motion. He saw the woman's eyes flicker between him and the gunman, like she wasn't sure if Mark was being serious or insane. Unfortunately, not everyone was as good at playing dead as Mark. A skinny teenage boy suddenly stood up, chest puffed out like he just decided today was the day to become Batman. "Hey, you're not gonna get away with this," the kid yelled. Mark groaned internally. There's always one. The gunman barely even turned to look at him before firing off a brutal back kick that nailed the kid right in the stomach. The teen crumpled to the ground in a heap, gasping for air. The thug smirked, clearly enjoying himself. "Nice try, kid. Didn't your mom ever tell you not to play hero?" Then he turned his attention to Mark, who was still sprawled out on the floor, half-heartedly raising one hand like he was waiting to ask a question in class. "See? This guy gets it," the thug said, pointing at Mark. Mark blinked up at him and offered a thumbs up. That got a laugh out of the thug, but it didn't last long because he turned back to the teenager, drawing his gun and leveling it at the boy's head. Mark sighed again, this time pushing himself up from the floor. He'd been more than happy to keep his head down and let them take the money, but the second he saw the gunman's finger tighten on the trigger, he knew he didn't have a choice anymore. "All right," Mark muttered. "Let's get this over with." The thug turned to see Mark standing up and immediately scowled. "The hell do you think you're?" Before he could finish, Mark flicked his wrist, discreetly using his gravity power and pulling the thug's gun hand and twisting it to the side. The shot went off, but it buried itself harmlessly into the ceiling. "What the?" the thug yelped, but Mark didn't give him a chance to recover. He yanked the guy forward and drove his knee straight into his gut, knocking the wind out of him. The thug stumbled back, but Mark grabbed his arm, flipped him over, and slammed him down onto his back hard enough to rattle the shelves. "Stay down," Mark said as he turned to the second thug. The guy behind the counter froze, his hand halfway to stuffing wads of cash into a duffel bag. His eyes darted from Mark to his partner lying on the ground and back again. Mark didn't give him a chance to draw his weapon. With a quick hop, he vaulted over the counter and drop-kicked the thug square in the chest. The man went flying back, crashing into the wall and slumping to the floor in a heap. Mark landed smoothly, dusted himself off, and leaned over to check if either of the two were still moving. Both were out cold. "Figures," he muttered, stepping back over the counter. "I just wanted to buy some clothes." But as soon as he left the store, his frustration grew tenfold. The chaos outside was even worse than he'd imagined. Gunmen were everywhere, raiding stores, dragging people around, firing wildly into the air to keep everyone terrified. "Great," Mark said as he surveyed the scene. "I walked in to die hard." Mark leaned against the railing, his arms crossed as he gazed down at the commotion unfolding below. Screams echoed through the mall, mixing with the sound of gunfire and shattering glass. Shoppers scrambled for cover, while gunmen barked orders and ransacked stores. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as his eyes scanned the scene. "I could end this in 10 minutes, maybe less," he thought. But the idea of stepping in didn't sit right with him. Not because he didn't care, he cared more than he'd ever admit, but because exposing himself in Gotham was risky. Especially here. This city had a way of remembering things, and Mark wasn't exactly anonymous anymore. He was plastered all over the news after saving the world from the Joker and his father, and to make matters worse, someone had decided to slap his face on a statue in the Hall of Justice. A damn statue. Mark still couldn't believe it. He'd nearly put his fist through a wall when he found out. "I'm not Superman," he'd told them. "I don't want to be." Yet there he was, immortalized in bronze, arms folded heroically and cape flapping like he was the second coming of the Man of Steel. Why was it so hard to believe he wanted to stay anonymous? He'd be much happier staying with Kara and Raven in Smallville until they all died. He didn't want the spotlight at all. Then came the screams. Mark straightened as the sound pierced the air, sharper and more urgent than before. His instincts kicked in, muscles tensing as he prepared to move, then froze when a blur dropped from the ceiling. His eyebrows rose as Batgirl hit the ground like a shadow, landing in a crouch before zipping into one of the shops. "Ha! Guess one of them is finally here, he thought. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the railing as he watched her work. It didn't take long. In less than 2 minutes, she was back out. 2 thugs slumped behind her and the hostages rushing past her toward safety. Still quick. He had to admit, she was good. Better than him in a fight, if he was being honest, even though he'd managed to put her on her but once before. Not that he liked to dwell on that. It wasn't exactly his proudest moment, especially since he was the criminal in that situation. Thinking back, something about her fighting him back then felt off. Like she'd been holding back, not just physically but mentally too. Maybe she saw him as some punk kid desperate to get money. Or maybe she thought he'd fold under pressure and quit before he got himself killed. Either way, it felt like a lifetime ago. Mark pushed off the railing and cracked his neck. I can't leave it all to her, he thought, flexing his fingers as he mentally prepared himself. Batgirl was good, great even, but the gunmen were spread out. Too many angles, too many variables, and if someone started firing into the crowd, even she wouldn't be fast enough to stop it. Besides, he owed her one. All right, let's do this, he muttered before hopping over the railing. Barbara had been looking forward to this day for weeks. Her first proper day off in months. No patrols, no late-night stakeouts, no bruises or broken ribs. Just a day to relax, unwind, and spend time with her friends. She even let herself get excited about it, which in hindsight, had been her first mistake. Because, of course, the universe couldn't let her have one good day. Barely an hour into their mall trip, gunmen burst into the building, firing into the air and sending everyone into a panic. And just like that, her day off was over. Barbara had slipped away from her friends as soon as the chaos started, muttering something about getting help before ducking into an employee restroom. 5 minutes later, she was Batgirl again, crouched on the roof and glaring down at the scene below. Her blood boiled as she watched the gunmen shove people to the ground and trash the stores. Not today, she thought, pulling her cowl into place. The grappling hook hissed as it shot out, anchoring to the ceiling above. She dropped down silently, landing in one of the stores before the thugs even realized she was there. 2 of them. Armed. One was fiddling with a lock on a glass case, while the other pointed his gun at a terrified cashier. Barbara moved before either of them could react. 2 batarangs flashed through the air, knocking their guns from their hands. The first thug cursed and turned, his arm suddenly stretching unnaturally as if every bone in it snapped and reformed in an instant. Meta, Barbara noted as she ducked under his swing. The movement looked painful, joints bending in ways they weren't supposed to. Still sloppy. She spun low, sweeping his legs out from under him and planting him on his back. He groaned, reaching for her, but Barbara didn't give him the chance. She fired her grappling hook, the reinforced hook slamming into his chest hard enough to make him sputter before throwing him backward into a shelf. The second thug tried to bolt, but Barbara leapt over the counter and cut him off. Her leg shot up, her boot catching him in the sternum hard enough to crack ribs. He went down in a heap, groaning before going still. Barbara barely spared them another glance. She was already moving, zipping out of the store and back into the shadows. Her body screamed at her as she moved, muscles aching and lungs burning from weeks of nonstop patrols. She'd been running on fumes for days now, but she didn't have time to slow down. Gotham didn't stop just because she was tired. Keep moving, she told herself, flipping her wrist to activate her gauntlet display. The mall's blueprints lit up on the screen, revealing a network of employee corridors running behind the stores. Good. She could use those to stay hidden, at least until she figured out what these guys were after. The problem was the unknown. Most of these thugs seemed ordinary, but at least one of them had abilities, and there could be more. She couldn't risk a straight-up fight, not when she didn't know what she was dealing with. Barbara reached the first door along the corridor and kicked it open, bursting inside. Her visor flickered as thermal signatures flared to life. Most of the civilians were huddled on the ground, trembling and trying not to cry. Except for one thug who was standing over a woman, leering down at her. Barbara didn't hesitate. She crossed the room in seconds, her foot slamming into the back of his neck. He crumpled, but Barbara caught his collar before he hit the floor and lowered him gently to avoid making noise. "Hey, Chad." "Stop messing around with the girls and help me," someone called from the back of the store. Barbara slipped through the aisles, keeping low as she approached. The second thug was busy stuffing a duffel bag with cash, his back turned to her. She pulled a small disc from her belt and tossed it at him. It sparked the moment it made contact, shocking him hard enough to make his body seize before he collapsed. 2 down. And that's how it went for the next 5 stores. By the time Barbara reached the atrium, her heart was pounding, her arms and legs heavy with fatigue. She ducked behind a pillar and surveyed the scene. 3 left? Where are the rest of them? She thought to herself with a frown. The first one was big, easily 6 feet 5 inches and built like a tank. The second was smaller but still muscular, pacing nervously and waving his gun like he expected the SWAT team to come crashing through the windows any second. But it was the last one that made Barbara pause. Skinny. Pale. Arms wrapped in dirty bandages. Something about him set off alarms in her head. That's not normal, she thought, narrowing her eyes. The skinny one seemed calm, even bored, as he leaned against the fountain. Where the hell is everyone else? The big one growled. Who cares? Bandages said, shrugging. If they were dumb enough to get caught, let him. We've got enough. How the hell are we getting out of here? The cops are already outside. The nervous one snapped. I'll handle them, Bandages replied, stepping away from the fountain. The rest of you slip out the side. Barbara's grip tightened on her batarang. She didn't know what this guy could do, but if he thought he could handle the police by himself, it wasn't good. Barbara's fingers twitched as she shot the grapple hook into the ceiling, swinging through the smoke cloud that had enveloped the trio. She dropped low, her boots hitting the floor with a soft thud just before she released a smoke pellet right in the center of the 3 gunmen. Their voices became a cacophony of shouts and curses as they flailed about in the thick haze, unable to see a thing. Without hesitation, Barbara struck first. Her knee slammed into the back of the man who had been nervously pacing. He crumpled under the force, grunting as the wind was knocked from his lungs. She didn't stay to watch him fall. Her body was already moving, quick as a flash. She spun, her foot arcing through the air as she aimed a high kick at the largest of the men. The moment her boot connected, a shock of pain shot up her leg, as if she'd kicked solid stone. The man barely flinched, his arm shooting out like a battering ram, attempting to grab her by the leg. But Barbara was already reacting, pushing off with all her strength and flipping backward, landing gracefully in a low squat. Durability enhancement, likely strength too, she analyzed. No surprise there. The man was built like a wall, and judging by his quick reflexes, he was a trained fighter, MMA or boxing perhaps. Her fingers danced across her utility belt, producing a handful of electric discs. She threw them at him without hesitation. The first hit him square in the chest, followed by another against his side. The discs crackled as electricity coursed through him, causing him to tense up, muscles spasming involuntarily. He screamed, his face contorting in pain, but Barbara didn't slow down. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a flash. Her blood ran cold as a burst of flame shot toward her, bright and wild like a dragon's breath. Instinctively, she threw herself into the fountain, her cape billowing around her as she shielded herself from the heat. The flames licked at her suit, but her armor held up, and the water helped dissipate the worst of it. She stayed submerged just long enough to avoid being scorched, her chest heaving with the effort of resisting the urge to gasp. When she emerged from the water, the smoke had started to clear, and her heart skipped a beat. Both men were still there, but their expressions had shifted, no longer masked with confusion but filled with malice. You scared me for a second, little lady, Gus said, his voice rough, like gravel in a blender. He cracked a wide grin. Thought Big Bat himself had come. Just the bat bitch it seems, Larry chimed in, a grin curling his lips. His arms were held high, and Barbara's eyes tracked the orange flames enveloping his limbs. The bandages that had been wrapped around his arms were burning away, revealing the sickening truth beneath. His skin had been completely scorched off, leaving only charred muscle and burnt tissue in its wake. Barbara didn't even spare them a reply. Her body was already moving again, springing out of the fountain with fluid precision, narrowly avoiding another wave of fire as it shot past her. Barbara's feet slammed into the ground as she landed, the impact rattling her bones. She didn't hesitate. Adrenaline surged through her, sharpening her focus. Her eyes flicked to Larry, and without a second thought, she charged at him. His flaming arms were erratic, unpredictable, but she could take him. He was no fighter, just a man who could burn things. She ducked under his wild swing, which sent a wave of flames, the heat from his flames brushing against her skin, but she didn't flinch. Her fist connected with his ribs, the crack of bone reverberating through her arm. Larry gasped, stumbling back, trying to regain his balance. Before he could react, Barbara pivoted and landed a spinning roundhouse kick to his head. The impact sent him crashing into a nearby display, knocking over a glass vase that shattered on the floor. But Barbara barely had time to register the satisfaction of her hit before she felt a chill run down her spine. Gus. He was on her in an instant, fists moving with terrifying speed. She blocked his first jab, but the second connected with her jaw, snapping her head back. Her teeth slammed together, the pain searing through her skull. She staggered, trying to regain her balance, but he wasn't letting up. He was fast, and his punches were like battering rams. She ducked under his next right hook, but the force of his swing grazed her cheek. Barbara winced but didn't let it slow her down. She was better than this, but her body was just so damn exhausted at the moment. She moved in, throwing a quick jab to his midsection, but he absorbed the blow, pivoting to avoid her follow-up. Larry was back on his feet now, fire dancing around his arms again. He threw a burst of flame at her, but this time Barbara was ready. She activated her grapple gun, shooting the line at the ceiling and pulling herself out of the line of fire just in time. The flames scorched the air where she'd been standing, but she was already flipping through the air, landing behind Gus with a solid thud. She didn't waste a second. She lunged at Gus, jumping on his back and locking him in a quick clinch, aiming to disable him with an elbow to the temple. But Gus was stronger than she anticipated. He headbutted her, the sickening crack of skull on skull ringing in her ears. Dazed, Barbara staggered back, her vision momentarily swimming. Before she could recover, Larry was there, throwing another flame-wrapped punch toward her. Barbara sidestepped, but not fast enough. The fire grazed her side, the heat searing through her suit and straight into her flesh. She screamed, the pain was intense. His flames were getting hotter now for some reason. The skin on her ribs blistered under the intense heat, and she gasped for air, trying to push through the agony. Gus was relentless. He closed in, his fists hammering into her chest and stomach. Each punch felt like a blow from a wrecking ball. The last one sent her stumbling backward, blood rushing to her mouth as her ribs groaned in protest. Barbara barely managed to steady herself, but it was enough time for Gus to land a devastating uppercut to her chin. Her head snapped backward, and she felt something crack inside her mouth. Teeth or jaw, she couldn't tell. Blood filled her mouth, but she spit it out, refusing to show weakness. She knew she couldn't let them keep controlling the fight. She activated a small explosive device, tossing it at Larry. It detonated with a sharp pop, sending him stumbling back, flames sputtering out as his body jerked from the shock. Barbara rushed toward him, but her vision blurred. Her breath was ragged, her body too battered to keep up at the pace she needed. Larry wasn't out for long. His arm shot out, flames pouring from his hands like fire hoses. Barbara dodged one burst, but the next hit her square in the chest. The heat was unbearable. Her suit absorbed some of it, but she could feel the burn through the fabric. Her muscles screamed in protest, and she dropped to one knee, struggling to breathe through the pain. The stench of her own singed skin made her stomach turn. Gus was on her again, and this time, she couldn't dodge. He grabbed her by the collar, lifting her off the ground with terrifying ease and wrapping his hand around her neck. Barbara tried to punch at his face, but he was too strong, his grip tightening around her neck. Her vision started to fade, the pressure on her windpipe cutting off her breath. "Not so tough now, are you, bat bitch?" Gus taunted, his voice low and grating. She managed to break free long enough to snap a smoke pellet at his feet, blinding both men with a thick cloud. But it wasn't enough. The smoke was already dissipating, and she was already exhausted, her every movement feeling like it was made from lead. As she moved, Larry struck again. This time, he wasn't using flames. Instead, he grabbed a jagged piece of metal from the wreckage of a nearby display and swung it toward her. It caught her across the arm, and the sharp metal dug deep, slicing through her suit and cutting into her flesh. Blood poured from the wound, and Barbara stumbled, nearly losing her footing. Gus was already closing in again. He threw a haymaker that caught her square in the ribs, and she felt something snap. The pain was blinding. She tried to block out the agony, but it was impossible. "Get up, Batgirl," Gus mocked, his voice dripping with disdain. Barbara's head swam as she tried to fight through the pain. She grabbed for a batarang, but her fingers were slick with blood, and the weapon slipped from her hand. Gus's fist came down one final time, connecting with her skull with sickening force. The impact sent her crashing to the floor, the world going black around the edges. She didn't move. Larry stood over her, his body still crackling with residual flames. "Yeah, I think she's done." Gus smirked down at Batgirl's battered form, his eyes scanning over her unconscious body. He moved closer, unbuckling his belt as he did. "We don't have time for that shit now." Larry snapped, his voice sharp with impatience. Gus growled in response, still fixated on Batgirl as he flipped her onto her back. His grin widened. "I'll be quick," he muttered, his eyes lingering on her helpless state. She tried to hide them, but he could tell she had a fat pair of knockers on her. His fingers brushed against her face, his lips curling into a sick grin as he took in her features. Just then, a voice cut through the air. "I forgot how disgusting people in Gotham were." Gus spun around, ready to lash out, but froze when he saw the man standing behind him. He wasn't as tall as Gus, nor as wide, but there was something about him, something in his posture that screamed trouble. The man had a bored expression on his face, like he was annoyed to even be here. Gus's patience thinned. "Get lost before I decide to smash you," Gus snarled, his eyes narrowing as he turned back to Batgirl. His attention was completely back on her, the man now irrelevant. Mark sighed deeply, his hands shoved into his pockets as he casually strolled over to Gus. He grabbed him by the shoulder, spinning him around before Gus could even react. "Do you have a death why?" Mark didn't let him finish. Without another word, he shoved Gus, sending him flying across the atrium. Gus slammed through the fountain, shattered pillars crumbling around him as he crashed into the wall, embedding himself in the concrete. The man groaned, barely conscious, his body a twisted mess. "Oops," Mark muttered, not even a hint of remorse in his voice. He didn't care if Gus died now, especially not after what he'd been about to do. "Rayera!" A scream split the air, and Mark turned just in time to see Larry charging at him, his arms engulfed in a blaze. The man was a wrecking ball of fire, launching a massive inferno toward Mark. Without hesitation, Mark raised his arm, manipulating gravity around him. The flames shifted in midair, turning and racing back at Larry. The heat from the flames scorched the air, and Larry's screams rang out as his body was consumed. Mark watched, unfazed, as Larry writhed in agony, his skin blackened and charred from the intense heat. It didn't take long before Larry's struggles died down, his body going limp. The flames flickered and snuffed out, leaving behind only the smell of burning flesh. Mark glanced down at Batgirl's limp body. She wasn't moving, but she was still breathing. He wasn't about to leave her here after what they'd done. With a grunt, he bent down, scooping Batgirl up effortlessly in his arms. As he rose into the air, he didn't even look back at the wreckage. The mall was a mess, but it wasn't his problem. Mark shook his head, irritated by how these idiots managed to take her down. She should have been able to deal with them easily. He shot through the ceiling, flying upwards toward his mom's apartment. The air whipped past him as he carried Batgirl out of the wreckage, the mall below him fading into the distance. She needed to rest, to heal. He didn't care if she wasn't exactly friendly with him. As he landed at his mom's apartment, he gently set Batgirl down on the couch. He checked her pulse, her breath steady but slow. She'd be fine, eventually. He didn't know if she'd ever thank him for this, but it didn't matter. They were even now. Heading to the kitchen, he grabbed the first aid kit from beneath the sink. His mom always kept one here when he'd get into fights back in the day. Sitting next to her, he carefully removed her uniform while keeping her mask off. Luckily, she wore a sports bra and underwear, otherwise he'd likely get a slap when she woke up. Covering her burns in an antiseptic cream and covered them in bandages before throwing a blanket over her. His mom wouldn't be back home till 7 p.m., so he had some time to hopefully let her rest and get rid of her. Leaning against the wall, he shot a text to Kara, explaining he would probably be home tomorrow, and he'd explain then. He then sighed he'd definitely be ordering online next time. Barbara stood outside the principal's office, leaning against the wall with a mix of frustration and concern. Mark had gotten himself into trouble again. Fighting, of course. She knew things weren't easy for him at this school, especially with the constant bullying he faced from the richer kids, the old bloods, as he called them. She got it, to an extent. As the commissioner's daughter, she didn't face the same level of harassment, but she could still sympathize with his situation. It was hard, though, to watch him fall into the same cycle every time. She tugged absent-mindedly at her plate, wishing he would learn to ignore them. But he was stubborn. She sighed, her fingers running through her hair as she watched the door to the office. She hoped they wouldn't suspend him again. He was smart, capable, but if he kept fighting like this, they'd have no choice but to expel him. The door opened with a creak, and out stepped Mark. His lip was cut, and a nasty black eye was swelling up on his face, but other than that, he seemed okay, better than Barbara had expected at least. He caught sight of her and grinned, the same arrogant smile that always seemed to melt her frustration. He swung his bag over his shoulder and started walking down the hall. Barbara, not having any of it, marched up to him and smacked him on the arm. "Don't give me that smile, bastard," she snapped, her tone sharp but still with a hint of concern. "What happened? Have you been suspended?" Mark rubbed his bruised cheek, still smiling despite the pain. "Nah, not this time," he said, shrugging nonchalantly. "Everyone saw Harold throw the first punch, so I'm off the hook. Principal just told me to head home early." Barbara let out a relieved breath, though her frown remained. She'd known Mark for years, and as much as he was a doofus, he was also one of the kindest, most genuine people she knew. Still, she couldn't help but get frustrated with him for always picking fights. She walked beside him as they headed toward the exit, her thoughts racing. If only he would just ignore them when they provoked him. "So where do you think you're going?" Mark's voice cut through her thoughts as he veered toward the exit. Barbara rolled her eyes. "Where do you think, meathead?" "I'm taking you home, just in case you have a concussion and pass out," she said, her tone mocking but with real worry behind it. She shot him an angry glare, though it just looked like a cute pout. Mark smirked, teasing. I didn't realize you cared, carrot cake," he said, reaching out to ruffle the top of her head. Barbara swatted his hand away, a faint blush creeping across her cheeks. "Don't call me that," she muttered, quickly turning her face away from him to hide it. Mark chuckled softly, the sound rich with amusement. "Come on then," he said, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the door with a playful tug. "We can play a few rounds of Smash at mine. I know you want to see me kick your butt again." Barbara yelped, not expecting him to be so forceful, but she followed along, trying to maintain her composure. Despite everything, she couldn't help the smile that tugged at her lips. It wasn't fair, really. He couldn't make her feel like this and get away with it. She'd have to get her revenge soon. "What? There's no way you could beat Batman in a fight," Barbara said, half shouting, half laughing. The idea was so absurd that she didn't even try to hide her amusement, letting out a loud laugh that echoed down the cracked and graffiti-covered street. Mark grinned, clearly unbothered by her disbelief. "I didn't say I could beat him," he shot back, already raising his fists and bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet. "But I reckon I could get 2, maybe 3 good shots in before he put me down." He fired off a quick jab and a straight, as if demonstrating the hits he'd land. Barbara crossed her arms and smirked, shaking her head. "You'd be lucky if you even saw him before he knocked you out," she said, tapping his arm with mock sympathy. "Batman's out of your league, bro." Mark rolled his eyes and dropped his fists, letting out an exaggerated sigh. Yeah. Keep doubting me." They kept walking, weaving through the filth and chaos of the streets. Barbara tried not to look at the drug dealers and sex workers posted up at every corner, some casually smoking or chatting like it was just another day at the office. She kept her gaze straight ahead, but her shoulders were tense, and her steps quickened without her even realizing it. She hated walking through this part of Gotham, hated how the people lurking in doorways always seemed to look at her a little too long. She didn't want to sound stuck up, but it was just so different from her neighborhood, where cops and their families lived, where people still watered their lawns and waved hello to each other. "Did you remember to tape Heroes and Demons?" Barbara asked, hoping to distract herself. They'd both been obsessed with the show ever since Mark's mom let them watch it past bedtime. Sure, it was cheesy and the special effects were garbage, but that was part of the charm. Heroes fighting monsters pouring out of hell portals? It was practically their religion at this point. Mark's face immediately fell, and Barbara's heart sank right along with it. "Crap," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I knew I forgot something this morning." "Moron." Barbara groaned, shoving him hard enough to make him stumble. Green Flashlight just confessed his love for Pigeon Woman. And now we have to wait until Sunday for the reruns. Mark checked his watch and looked up quickly. "We can still make it back to mine in time if we run. Come on." Before Barbara could protest, he grabbed her arm and took off down the sidewalk, dragging her along behind him. They dodged pedestrians, squeezed between trash cans, and jumped over puddles that Barbara didn't even want to think about. Her glasses nearly slipped off her nose twice, and she was out of breath by the time Mark finally skidded to a stop. "Why'd you stop?" Barbara asked, panting as she adjusted her glasses. Mark pointed to a narrow alleyway cutting between two abandoned buildings. "Shortcut." Barbara immediately frowned. "No. Your mom specifically told us to stick to the main roads." "It's the middle of the day," Mark said, flashing his signature grin like that was supposed to settle the argument. Barbara wasn't having it. "My dad tells me the same thing. We should really just stick to the main road." Mark chuckled and stepped into the alley dramatically, throwing his arms out wide. "See? Nothing happened. Come on, let's go before we miss it." Barbara hesitated. Something about the alley set her on edge. Maybe it was the way the shadows stretched longer than they should have, even in daylight. Or maybe it was the overflowing dumpster and broken bottles scattered near the entrance. "Mark." She started, her voice quieter now. "Relax," he said, motioning for her to follow. "We'll be out the other side in 2 minutes." Barbara bit her lip and forced herself to step inside. Her heart thudded in her chest as the alley closed in around her, the high brick walls pressing tight on both sides. Mark walked ahead, totally unfazed. "Come on. We gotta hurry, or we'll miss it." Mark called back, picking up the pace as he weaved around the overflowing dumpster. Barbara tried to keep up, her heart still racing from their earlier run. She adjusted her glasses as they started to slip, cursing under her breath. "Slow down, dumbass. Not all of us have legs like stilts." Mark smirked but didn't slow down. "Sucks to be short," he teased, looking back at her for just a second. And that's when it happened. A blur shot out from behind the dumpster. Thud. Mark hit the wall hard, his shoulder slamming into the bricks with enough force to knock the wind out of him. "Mark!" Barbara screamed, panic spiking through her veins as she rushed forward. Mark staggered but didn't go down. He braced himself against the wall, already straightening up with a wince. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was tight. "You won't be for long if you don't empty your pockets," a sharp, grating voice called out. Barbara turned toward it and froze. The guy standing there couldn't have been older than 17, but he looked worn down, pale, sweaty, and jittery. His clothes were torn and stained, hanging off his thin frame like rags. His eyes twitched as he spoke, wide and bloodshot. "A junkie." "We will, just don't," Barbara started, but Mark cut her off. "Hell no." Mark barked, pushing himself off the wall and squaring his shoulders. Though he still wasn't taller than the other kid since he was only 13. Barbara grabbed his arm. "Mark, just give it to him." "It's not worth it," she hissed, her voice low and urgent. She could tell from the way the junkie's hands shook and his eyes darted that he wasn't stable. He'd do anything for another hit, and right now, Mark was pissing him off. I'm not giving this piece of trash anything. Mark roared, his voice echoing through the alley. He can crawl back into the gutter he came from. Barbara barely had time to shout before Mark swung. His fist connected with the junkie's jaw, sending him stumbling back into a pile of trash bags and broken bottles. Mark, stop. Barbara cried, but it was too late. The junkie came up fast, wild-eyed and furious, and this time, he wasn't empty-handed. Barbara saw the flash of the knife, but Mark didn't. Mark, no. She didn't think. She just moved. Her body slammed into Mark, shoving him to the ground and out of the way. Relief hit her for a split second when she saw him safe, but then she noticed the look on his face. Pure horror. She didn't understand, until the pain hit. It wasn't instant. At first, it was just pressure, like something sharp was pinning her in place. Then the fire bloomed. She looked down and saw the knife buried in her stomach, the blade glinting under the dim alley light. Oh! The world tilted, and she hit the ground. Barbara! Mark's voice tore through the haze, but it sounded far away. She heard more shouting. A roar. The crash of bodies. But her vision was already starting to blur. Through half-lidded eyes, she saw Mark tackle the junkie and drive him into the wall. She thought she saw him lift the guy off the ground, but that couldn't be right. Then Mark threw him across the alley like a rag doll. The junkie hit the opposite wall and crumpled. Before he could get up, Mark was on him again. Barbara blinked and tried to focus. She saw Mark draw his fist back, saw it come down hard. Crack. The junkie didn't move after that. Then Mark was back at her side, his hands shaking as he pressed them against the wound in her stomach. Stay with me, Barb. Stay awake, okay? I'll get help. Where's your phone? His voice was panicked, breaking as he spoke. She'd never heard him sound like that before. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her lips trembled, and her breath hitched. Mark. Tears burned her eyes and rolled down her cheeks. She didn't want to die. She couldn't die. Not here, not like this. The alley was spinning, the shadows getting darker. Mark's voice kept cutting in and out, calling her name, begging her to hold on. She tried. But the darkness kept creeping closer until it engulfed her completely. Barbara's eyes snapped open, her chest heaving as if she'd just surfaced from drowning. Her breaths came sharp and uneven, and for a moment, the pain in her stomach felt as real as it had that day in the alley. It was strange. She hadn't dreamt about that day for a long time. Her hand instinctively moved down, fingers trembling as they brushed over bandages. The touch sent a jolt through her system, and then the memories came flooding back. The fight, the mall, Gus, Larry. Her body tensed, adrenaline spiking. She sat up fast, ignoring the flare of pain as her muscles protested. Her eyes scanned the room, her mind struggling to make sense of where she was. Floral patterned curtains, cheap beige carpet, and mismatched furniture. Debbie's apartment. Before she could fully process it, a voice behind her made her freeze. Chill out there, Batgirl. I'd rather you not trash my mom's place. Her blood turned to ice. That voice. It couldn't be. She didn't turn around. She refused to. Her fingers dug into the fabric of the blanket she'd been covered with, and her heart hammered against her ribs. This isn't real. I'm dreaming. Or hallucinating. Hey, Red. Kinda rude pretending I'm not here. She clenched her fists, trying to steady herself, but the voice, his voice, cut through her like a blade. It was arrogant, familiar, and so alive. She had to look. She had to. Steeling herself, Barbara slowly turned, and there he was. Mark. He stood casually in the doorway, arms crossed, wearing that same arrogant grin he always had. He looked alive. Breathing. Real. Barbara's breath hitched. I must be dead. She whispered, barely audible. Mark heard it anyway. He arched an eyebrow and smirked. Almost. But I dealt with those bastards before they could finish the job. No need to thank me or anything, though I do accept cash. I hear you bats are loaded. Barbara barely registered his words. Her mind was still struggling to accept what she was seeing. This can't be real. She reached out, almost afraid he'd disappear if she touched him. But before she could make contact, Mark grabbed her hand. His grip was warm, solid, and that was all it took to shatter the last bit of doubt. He was real. The dam broke. Tears welled up and spilled over as relief crashed into her. Mark. She choked out before lunging forward, throwing her arms around him and tackling him to the ground. What the hell? Mark blurted as they hit the carpet with a thud. He winced as Barbara buried her face in his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Mark's confusion was obvious. His hands hovered awkwardly, unsure of whether to push her off or pat her back. He settled for poking her shoulder. Do you mind getting off? Barbara didn't respond. She just clung to him tighter, her body trembling against his. Mark's discomfort grew due to her state of undress. With the blanket kicked off, she wore only a sports bra and panties, along with the bandages wrapping her stomach. He flushed slightly, but tried to focus on the bigger picture. Hey, seriously, what's wrong with you? Mark asked, his voice softer this time. Barbara finally lifted her head, tears streaking her face. You're alive, she said, voice cracking. Her face was contorted in a funny way, making her look really strange. Mark's eyes narrowed as something clicked in his head. He'd been suspicious since she'd woken up, but now it hit him like a freight train. The way she'd looked at him, the way she'd called his name, he'd seen that expression before. Barbara, he said, barely more than a whisper. Her eyes widened, her breath catching. She froze. That was all the confirmation Mark needed. His eyes went wide. It is you. Barbara scrambled back, wiping her face with her hand as she tried to recover. No, it's not. Mark pushed himself up, pointing at her. Moron, you just admitted it. You're the moron. Barbara snapped. They stared at each other, frozen for a moment. Then they both burst out laughing. Mark fell back against the floor, still chuckling as he ran a hand through his hair. I can't believe it, you're Batgirl. Barbara wiped her face again, sniffling as she tried to pull herself together. I can't believe you're alive. You're supposed to be dead, Mark. I thought I lost you forever, and yet here you are. Her voice cracked at the end, and Mark's smile faded just a little. He scratched the back of his neck. Yeah, well. He shrugged. I've nearly died a few times now. It's kinda lost its novelty at this point. Barbara's eyes softened, her tears drying but leaving her cheeks flushed. She looked at him like she couldn't quite believe he was real, like any second he might disappear. You're unbelievable, she whispered, shaking her head with a watery smile. Mark was about to respond, but then his eyes drifted, just for a second, and it hit him again that Barbara was sitting there in nothing but a sports bra underwear. He immediately looked away, clearing his throat as his face reddened. You might want to, He gestured vaguely in her direction. Barbara blinked before realizing what he meant. Her eyes widened, and a bright blush spread across her cheeks. Damn perv, she muttered, snatching the blanket off the couch and pulling it tightly around herself. Mark smirked, though he was careful not to look again. I wasn't looking, relax. Barbara glared at him but couldn't keep the fondness out of her eyes. She let out a long breath and instead of moving away, slid down to sit next to him against the wall. Mark raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. You're really alive, Barbara said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder like she used to back when they were kids. She clutched the blanket tightly, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I'd never see you again. Mark stiffened for just a moment before relaxing, letting his head rest back against the wall. Yeah, well, I'm not that easy to get rid of. Barbara smiled through the tears still glistening in her eyes. You idiot. Mark chuckled lightly. Takes one to know one. They sat in silence for a while. Barbara felt the steady rise and fall of his chest, grounding her. She still didn't understand how this was possible, how Mark could be here. They'd said he was killed by the Joker, but right now she didn't care. I missed you, Mark, she admitted quietly. Mark hesitated before replying, his voice softer than usual. I missed you too, Carrot Cake. Beep 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 alarms screamed through the Cadmus Research Center. Soldiers scrambled into defensive positions, weapons raised and safeties off. Scientists fled down reinforced corridors, slamming security doors behind them. In the command center, Amanda Waller stood in front of the main console. Screens flickered with static and bloodied hallways. Her jaw was tight, her eyes cold. Get those damn blast doors shut. Focus all turrets on the lower levels. I want reinforcements, now. No one responded. The comms were filled with screaming, gunfire, and static. On the monitors, 3 viltrumites tore through the facility. They weren't in a rush. They didn't need to be. Nolan crushed a soldier's skull with one hand, blood and bone coating his white suit. His prosthetic arm dented the steel wall as he shoved another guard into it hard enough to break his spine. The man twitched on the floor until Nolan stomped down on his head. He didn't look down. He didn't stop moving. Anissa caught a soldier mid-sprint, yanking him back by the collar. He screamed, clawing at her hands. She slammed him into the floor, ribs shattering. He coughed blood, but she wasn't done. She drove her fist into his chest, snapping through bone. She didn't even look when she pulled her hand out and let him drop. Lucan plowed through the defenses. He caught a burst of gunfire in the chest and didn't flinch. He grabbed one of the shooters, lifting him off the ground by the neck. The man kicked and gagged, clawing at Lucan's arm. Lucan squeezed. The skin split and blood sprayed. He dropped the body and moved to the next. The soldiers fought back, but it didn't matter. Nolan ripped through a group of them, hitting one so hard his body folded backward over a railing. Anissa dodged bullets like they weren't there, snapping necks and breaking limbs in seconds. Lucan didn't dodge. He let them shoot him until they ran out of bullets, then crushed their heads one by one. Waller's fingers tightened around the edge of the console. Containment has failed. Prepare emergency countermeasures. Ma'am, one of the techs said, voice shaking, the vault doors won't hold. They're already breaching, the feed cut out. Waller didn't blink. Activate Galatea. The techs froze. A few exchanged panicked looks. You heard me, Waller snapped. Activate her now. Before anyone could argue, the door to the command center bent inward. Metal groaned as it crumpled, the reinforced steel folding like cardboard. Nolan stepped through first, blood dripping from his hands. Anissa followed, wiping gore off her cheek. Lucan walked in last, cracking his knuckles. Waller, Nolan said as he floated inside, his voice calm but heavy. Nolan, Waller spat back, her teeth clenched so tight it hurt. A grin spread across his face as he stepped forward. The lab technicians and soldiers froze. Some made the mistake of running. Anissa blurred across the room, cutting them down before they reached the door. Blood sprayed the walls, and their bodies hit the floor in broken piles. It wasn't easy to find you, Nolan said, his eyes scanning the room like he was already bored. After you moved from your last base, you really thought you could hide? He floated closer, brushing dust off his suit. We had to tear apart 5 other facilities before we found this one. He stopped next to Waller, placing his hand on a technician's shoulder. The man flinched but didn't move, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Nolan smirked. I bet you regret ever working with me. Waller didn't answer. Her eyes locked on his, sharp and unyielding. Nolan laughed softly. You always thought the League would enslave you. You feared them ruling over humanity, didn't you? He leaned in closer, voice low but sharp. And in the end, it was me. And you helped. Waller's fists clenched at her sides, her breathing tight and shallow. How does that feel? Nolan asked, his smile fading. The tech under Nolan's grip whimpered. Don't. Waller snapped, but Nolan didn't even look at her. Splat. The man's head burst in Nolan's hand, bones cracking, flesh splitting. Blood hit Nolan's suit and Waller's face. She didn't flinch, but her eyes burned. Nolan let the body drop. No matter, he said, wiping his bloody fingers on his cape. I need something from you. And what's that? Waller hissed. Nolan's eyes narrowed. The location of the League members and the systems you use to track them. Waller didn't blink. And Nolan continued, "Where's the Kryptonian?" "Supergirl." "No." The word left her mouth before she could stop herself. Lucan snarled and crossed the room in a blur. He grabbed a console and hurled it against the wall, shattering glass and metal. Sparks rained down, lighting the blood on the floor. "I'll make you talk." Lucan roared as he grabbed Waller by the throat and lifted her off the ground. Waller's boots kicked uselessly, but she didn't cry out. "They call you the Wall," Lucan said, his fingers tightening around her neck. Her skin started to bruise. "Watch how fast I break you." Her hands clawed at his grip, but he didn't budge. "Keep her alive," Nolan ordered without even looking. Lucan bared his teeth, but didn't squeeze any harder. Nolan turned to Anissa. "Question the others." Anissa didn't hesitate. She grabbed a technician by the hair and yanked him out of his chair. He screamed as she slammed him against the floor, knocking the wind out of him. "Where's your data vault?" she demanded. He stammered, blood dripping from his nose. I don't know." She snapped his arm backward. Bones tore through skin. He howled, but she just grabbed his other arm. "Try again," she said flatly. Behind her, Lucan let out a low growl as Waller's legs stopped kicking. She was turning purple. "Enough," Nolan said, walking over. "We need her awake." Lucan dropped her. She hit the floor hard, coughing and gasping for air. Nolan knelt beside her, wiping blood from her face with his thumb. "I'll ask again, Waller," he said quietly. "Where's the Kryptonian?" Waller smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. "She's right here." Floating high above the burning Cadmus base, Galatea smirked. Her short blonde hair whipped in the wind, and her white suit clung to her curves, leaving little to the imagination. The design mimicked the viltrumite uniforms, but hers flaunted her body, deep cleavage framed by the tight fabric and legs bare from the upper thigh down, long and sculpted like a statue carved to perfection. In one hand, she casually held what looked like an ICBM, her fingers digging into the metal casing as if it were made of paper. Smoke and fire billowed below her, the base already in chaos, sirens wailing uselessly. She could almost picture Waller's smug face down there, waiting for her savior to arrive, waiting for her weapon to step in and clean up the mess. Not today. Galatea tilted her head, her grin widening as she looked down at the writhing ants scurrying through the wreckage. She spun the missile lazily, like a baton. "Sorry, Waller," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "It's been fun, really. But I think it's time we part ways. I'm sure you'll understand, being so pragmatic and all." Her fingers crushed the missile shell as she pulled her arm back. "Consider this my resignation." She hurled the missile downward, and it tore through the air like a thunderclap, whistling as it plummeted toward the shattered base. The explosion came a heartbeat later. A deafening roar shook the ground, fire blooming outward in a blinding wave. The shockwave ripped through what was left of the walls, tearing metal beams apart like twigs. Fuel lines ignited, setting off a chain of secondary explosions that engulfed the remains of the command center. Flaming bodies were flung into the air before crashing down in pieces. Shattered glass rained over smoldering corpses. Soldiers who had survived the viltrumites' attack were vaporized instantly, and the ones outside the blast radius screamed as the fire caught their uniforms and flesh. Galatea hovered above it all, her grin never fading as the shockwave pushed at her but did nothing to move her. Smoke and flame reflected in her eyes. "I wish I could savor this moment," she said with almost a moan as her hand traced down her body, wiping a speck of soot off her thigh. Taking one last look at the crater below, she shot off into the sky. She wasn't under any delusion that the viltrumites were dead, and they'd likely be after her when they recovered. For now, all she had to do was figure out a way to get that damn kryptonite out of her head. Down below, in the smoking crater where the Cadmus base had once stood, Nolan, Anissa, and Lucan burst free from the layers of twisted steel and shattered concrete that had buried them. Dust and ash billowed around them as they rose from the rubble, unscathed but seething. The fires still burned, licking at the edges of the crater, but they paid it no mind. Nolan stood at the center, his eyes scanning the horizon. His uniform was torn and dirted, and his prosthetic promethium arm glinted in the flickering firelight. Blood and grime streaked his face, making his expression look even more terrifying. Anissa landed beside him, brushing chunks of debris off her shoulders with a look of disgust. Her short black hair was matted with soot, and her now exposed arms and legs were streaked with dirt, but she didn't care. She was more annoyed than anything else. Lucan followed last, towering over them as he stomped out of the wreckage. His dark skin was smeared with soot, his muscles tense and twitching with rage. He barely restrained the urge to smash the nearest piece of debris into powder. Nolan's fists clenched as he glared up at the sky. His jaw tightened, and the veins in his neck bulged as he pieced it together. Supergirl. It had to be. She's gone, he growled, his voice low and dangerous. His eyes remained locked on the horizon, scanning for any trace of movement. Anissa crossed her arms, her brow furrowed. What now? She hit us and ran, just like a coward. She spat onto the ground, clearly frustrated. Nolan didn't even look at her. His voice came out sharp and cold. Anissa. Lucan. Find her. Track her down. Anissa's expression twisted. And what about you? I thought we agreed to stick together. Nolan finally turned to face her, his eyes burning with rage. It's taking too long. Anissa's lips parted to argue, but Nolan's next words froze her. If you can't bring her in yourselves, then die. Lucan let out a low growl, cracking his knuckles. Anissa's eyes widened for a moment, then narrowed. She scowled, but said nothing. Without another word, Nolan shot into the sky, the force of his takeoff kicking up dirt and rubble in a violent gust. The cloud swallowed him as he disappeared, leaving the two younger viltrumites alone in the ruins. Anissa glared after him before looking at Lucan. Let's go. Lucan rolled his shoulders, his massive frame shifting as he prepared to take off. I hope she fights, he muttered. She will. Anissa smirked darkly, then rocketed into the air with Lucan close behind, leaving nothing but fire and corpses in their wake. It was an awkward moment in the apartment as Mark and Barbara sat on opposite ends of the sofa. Neither of them knew what to say. There were far too many words to choose from, each weighed down by old regrets and half-forgotten promises. In their earlier years, they had been inseparable, two kids who swore they'd always have each other's backs. But then came the incident that put Barbara in Gotham General, and everything changed. For Mark, that memory hurt more than any punch he'd ever taken. Even worse was the last time they'd spoken, when Barbara had begged him to stop what he was doing. Stop breaking the law. Stop walking the path that would only lead to a jail cell. He hadn't listened, and then Batman and the Justice League had gotten involved, blowing things out of proportion. Still, he couldn't deny that he'd chosen that road in the first place. Even now, he wasn't sure he regretted it, since it led him here in a roundabout way. But it left him with regrets, especially where Barbara was concerned. The silence between them stretched. Mark pretended to study a stain on the carpet, while Barbara stared at a spot on the wall. Outside, the muffled sounds of Debbie's neighbors echoed through thin walls. A TV turned up too loud, someone shouting from the hallway. The living room was small and cramped, the sofa taking up most of the space. Finally, they both spoke. Lise. They stopped, looked at each other, and tried again. Sorry you go. Sorry you go. No you. No you. They both realized how ridiculous they sounded and broke into laughter. The tension eased, at least for a moment. But that light mood slipped away as quickly as it came, and Mark felt his face grow serious again. The memories flooded back, guilt piling up in his chest. I'm sorry, Barb, he said quietly, eyes dropping to the floor once more. Barbara frowned, confused. Sorry for what? She asked, moving her gaze from his hands to his face. From her perspective, Mark was the victim in all of this. She couldn't figure out what burden he felt he needed to own up to. Mark sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. For a lot of things, I guess. For not listening to you when you told me to straighten out. But mostly. He paused, fighting the lump in his throat. Mostly for not talking to you again after you left the hospital. He couldn't shake the image of Barbara lying in that alley, blood pooling under her. He remembered how it felt to see her lying in a hospital bed, his best friend, his only friend, stabbed because he'd picked a fight he shouldn't have. Barbara slid closer to him on the couch, ignoring the dull ache in her side. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "I get it," she said, voice softening. "You felt guilty about what happened. You blamed yourself. But I never held it against you, Mark. It hurt more knowing that I'd lost my best friend than anything else." Her words cut through him. She had been the one who got stabbed, and yet she worried about losing him. He swallowed hard, staring at her hand on his arm. He remembered how warm it felt when they were kids, how she'd always grab his sleeve and drag him off to some new adventure. Now, her touch reminded him that he had abandoned her when she needed him most. He'd been so wrapped up in his own guilt, he never thought to ask how she felt, about the alley, the hospital, about him. Barbara saw the sorrow in his eyes and felt her heart twist. She raised her other hand, cupping his cheek and gently tilting his head so he'd look at her. "It's okay, Mark," she whispered. "We were kids. Don't be so hard on yourself." She remembered the scrawny boy who always tried to protect her, who always told her that someday they'd leave Gotham and see the world. That kid was still there in Mark's eyes, behind all the pain and guilt. Mark closed his eyes for a second, leaning into her hand, soaking in that small comfort he'd missed for so long. He'd made a promise to himself that day. If he ever got the chance, he wouldn't run from her again. He opened his eyes and found Barbara watching him, her own eyes misty. "I won't leave you again," he said, his voice rough. "I promise." Barbara swallowed, nodding slowly. She'd waited a long time to hear him say something like that, even if she hadn't known it. Despite everything, his criminal past, the secrets they both held now, she still trusted him. Because under all of it, Mark was still the boy who'd risk his life for her. They sat there for a while, the old tension easing into a sense of calm. The hum of the apartment's outdated heater kicked on, rattling a vent in the corner. Barbara broke eye contact first, brushing a stray tear away with the back of her hand. "So, what do we do now?" she asked, letting out a shaky laugh that barely masked her pain. Mark shrugged and replied, "I guess we could watch some TV, or maybe eat." Barbara managed a small smile as she leaned against him. She pressed her head against his shoulder. For a while, they sat there watching cartoons on the small TV. Barbara listened to the steady sound of Mark's breathing and felt the warmth of his body. Slowly, her eyes grew heavy, and she began to drift into sleep. She fell asleep in the dim light of the living room. Her head rested on his shoulder. Her breathing evened out as she lost herself in a light sleep. Time passed unnoticed by her as the cartoons played and faded into silence. When Barbara awoke, the room was dark. She opened her eyes and saw that the light from the TV had dimmed, and the clock on the wall showed that the sun had already set. A low groan escaped her lips as she pushed herself up from the sofa. She looked around, noting the silence and the dim glow of the streetlights outside the window. In the kitchen, Mark was busy. He moved behind the counter and spoke in a low tone. "Raven, I'll be a little late." "Yeah, tell Kara," he said. He paused, then added, "I love you. Bye." His voice was calm as he set a few items on the counter and walked around the kitchen. Barbara rose slowly from the sofa, limping slightly as she made her way to the kitchen. She sat on the stool by the counter and watched Mark move about. "Hey, Carrot, you feeling hungry?" Mark said with a grin as he approached the counter. "I could order a pizza. I'll even put spinach and pineapple on it for you," he offered in a teasing tone. Barbara shook her head. "I need to go," she replied, her voice low. Mark raised an eyebrow at her. "Is your dad expecting you home? Aren't you at college?" he asked. Barbara nodded. "I need to get back to work," she said as she pushed herself up from the stall. Mark circled the counter. "Work? Don't you think you're not exactly well enough to do that at the moment?" he said as he leaned on the counter and looked at her. Barbara quoted something Bruce had once told her. "Gotham never sleeps, so neither can I," she said firmly. She reached for her bag to grab her things, but before she could, Mark stepped in front of her with his arms crossed and a chiding look on his face. "Barbara, you can't go out there," Mark said in a firm tone. Barbara tried to walk past him. She stumbled slightly as she moved. "I have no choice, Mark. With Batman and Nightwing no longer out there, it is up to the rest of us to pick up the slack," she said, her voice edged with determination despite the fatigue in her limbs. Mark shook his head and placed his hand on her shoulder. "I'm sure Gotham can survive a few weeks without you," he said. "And how many people will get hurt in that time? How many will die? How many people could I have saved?" Her eyes were troubled as she said this. After a long pause, Mark added, "So what, you don't owe them anything." He saw the look on Barbara's face and immediately knew he had misspoken. Barbara's face hardened. "Why are you so afraid of being a hero?" she asked, turning to him. "Is it so bad to help someone without expecting anything in return? What's wrong with a little kindness?" Mark's eyes narrowed. "You call it kindness. I call it chains. And I refuse to shackle myself to a world that takes and takes until there's nothing left of me," he said, his tone bitter. Then he said, "It's naive to think any of this will make a difference." Barbara looked at him and said, "You think us all naive?" Her voice rose slightly. "Every night I go out there, I know I'm no closer to making the world a better place than the night before, but it's not about that. It's about letting a father go home to see his daughter, letting a wife see her husband again, stopping a girl from being traumatized by a random thug." Barbara then got up slowly, limping over to the chair where her things were neatly folded next to the sofa. She picked them up with care. "You're right, I don't owe them anything," she said softly, "but if I can save even one person, I'll give them everything I've got." She began to change into her Batgirl outfit. First, she set her bag down and unzipped Mark's jacket. She pulled out her mask and looked at it before putting it back down. Mark watched her with a quiet intensity from across the room. He did not speak, but his eyes showed concern. Then, with a deep, irritated sigh, he said, "Fine, you win." He stepped forward and placed his hand on her shoulder. Barbara looked up and met his gaze. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Finally, he said, "I don't want to be a hero, but the idea of you hurting yourself even more is worse." Mark's face softened, and he replied, "I want you to rest and recover before going back out there." He paused and then added, "I'll take your place for the meantime." Barbara frowned and looked at him, confusion and concern mixing in her eyes. "What do you mean? Do you even know what you're doing?" she asked, her tone edged with worry. Mark shook his head slowly. "You can help me over the phone or something," he said. "I can do it. I did save the world twice. I have a little bit experience." Barbara hesitated for a moment, her expression still skeptical. Finally, she stuck her finger in the air and said, "No killing." Mark rolled his eyes at that comment and then said, "Fine, no killing," in a gruff voice. Barbara smiled then, and she stepped forward to hug him tightly. He returned the hug, holding her close for a long moment. At that moment, the door opened and Debbie, Mark's mom, stepped into the room. Her voice broke the quiet. "Oh, honestly, Mark, you're already finding another one," she said, her tone light. Mark pulled back slightly, and Debbie's face lit up when she saw Barbara. "Barbara, I haven't seen you for years," she said, excitement clear in her voice. Barbara's eyes brightened as she looked at Debbie. Debbie rushed over and hugged her, fussing over her injuries. She examined the bandages and asked, "Let me take you to the hospital." Barbara shook her head. "I'm fine, Mrs. Grayson." "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. Debbie looked at Barbara and then at Mark. "Stay for dinner," she said. "I made a big meal, and it's been too long." Mark and Barbara exchanged a glance. But she agreed and they sat down together at the table with Debbie. For the rest of the evening, they ate dinner and caught up. They spoke about old times. Debbie knew Barbara nearly as well as Mark did and was upset when she didn't come over anymore despite how much she urged Mark to invite her. Debbie asked Barbara about her work in her college, and Barbara answered vaguely as she still didn't know she was Batgirl. Barbara talked about her work and the subject she was studying, and Debbie listened carefully. To Barbara it felt like just yesterday she was here with both of them, and it made her feel warm inside. After dinner, and after a few goodbyes, Mark walked Barbara to the door, and they walked outside the apartment where they both went into an alleyway. Mark then picked her up and flew Barbara back to her place, keeping his speed steady so she wouldn't feel the wind pressure too much. She clung to him, arms wrapped around his shoulders, though he could tell she was trying not to seem like she needed the support. She was still hurting, even if she wouldn't admit it. He touched down in front of her building, lowering her gently to her feet. She wobbled a little but stayed upright, adjusting her jacket as she looked up at him. They didn't speak right away. The night air was cool, and Gotham's usual hum of distant sirens and city life filled the silence. Barbara finally let out a small sigh, rubbing her arms. "Thanks, Mark." Mark just nodded. "You sure you're good?" Barbara smirked, her old confidence slipping back into place. "Yeah. I'm tougher than I look." Mark snorted. Yeah, I've heard that before." She hesitated for a second before stepping forward and hugging him again, arms tight around his waist. He exhaled through his nose, but hugged her back just as tightly. "Be careful, okay?" she murmured against his chest. Mark pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. "You too." Barbara nodded, stepping back toward the entrance of her building. Mark waited, making sure she got inside before turning away. He crouched slightly, then shot off into the sky, a blur of motion as he left Gotham behind. The cold air cut past him, but he barely felt it. His body adjusted automatically, as it always did. He moved fast, slicing through the atmosphere like it was nothing, the world below reduced to streaks of light and shadow. He covered miles in seconds, watching as Gotham's dark skyline gave way to open land, then farmland. Within moments, he slowed, angling down toward the Kent farm. His boots hit the dirt in front of the house without a sound. He straightened, rolling his shoulders as he looked around. Everything was quiet. The porch light was still on, casting a faint glow over the fields. Mark walked down the dirt road toward the house, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust with each step. The night was still, the only sounds coming from the faint rustling of the trees and the occasional chirp of crickets in the distance. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the lingering tension in his muscles. The flight back had done little to clear his head. A lot had happened. Seeing Barbara again, their conversation, the argument, taking her place in Gotham, it was a lot to take in. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he reached the house. The door wasn't locked. It never was. Smallville was the kind of place where people still trusted their neighbors, where everyone knew everyone. More importantly, inside the house were two of the strongest women on the planet, so security wasn't exactly a concern. Pushing the door open, he stepped inside, the warmth of the house washing over him. He dropped his bag by the door. He hadn't been able to get everything he needed. Most shops had closed by the time he got around to it, but he'd managed to grab some essentials before heading back. As he rubbed his eyes, trying to push away the exhaustion settling into his bones, he heard a soft voice call his name. "Mark." He looked up and smiled as Raven walked toward him, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. She was dressed in one of his old shirts, oversized and draping off her frame in a way that made her look even smaller than she was. Her dark hair was slightly messy, her violet eyes soft but sharp, watching him closely. "You're late," she murmured, stopping just in front of him. Mark shrugged. "Got caught up with an old friend." Raven's gaze flickered over him, searching for any signs of injury. "Are you okay?" He nodded, but she didn't look convinced. Her fingers ghosted over his arm before she sighed and leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. Mark wrapped his arms around Raven without thinking, his chin resting lightly on the top of her head. He could feel the steady rise and fall of her breathing against him. "I missed you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I missed you too," Mark said, tightening his hold on her momentarily before pulling back. "Didn't mean to worry you." Raven gave him a look that was hard to decipher, then shook her head slightly and pulled him by the arm. "Come to bed," she murmured, leading him toward one of the guest rooms. Mark stopped, confused. Why the guest room? She smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "You look stressed, and I don't want to wake Kara." "But we can't do that." "You're still healing down there," Mark protested, his tone laced with concern. "I know," Raven acknowledged, her voice calm yet determined, continuing to guide him into the room. She closed the door behind them, the dim light casting long shadows. Inside, she turned to face him, her hands sliding up his chest in a way that was both comforting and suggestive. "But we can still relax," she said. Mark felt a mix of desire and duty, but Raven's touch was persuasive. Her dark purple hair framed her face, her eyes held an inviting warmth, and her body moved was partially revealed by her loose pajama vest. She leaned in, her lips close to his ear, whispering, "Just us for a moment." Her hands trailed down his arms, guiding him toward the bed. He knew he should resist, but the way Raven's hands felt on him, the way she looked at him with that blend of understanding and desire, was too much. As she gently pushed him down onto the bed and straddled him, her presence was both soothing and arousing. Raven, still straddling Mark, reached down and began to lift her nightgown. She pulled it over her head, revealing her body to him. Her skin was pale, almost glowing in the dim light of the guest room. Her melons were full, the curves pronounced against her slender frame, topped with dark buds that stood out starkly against her light skin. She then turned her attention to Mark's pants, her fingers deftly undoing the button and zipper. After their intense session, Mark, Kara, and Raven lay on the bed, their bodies coated in sweat, the air around them heavy with the scent of sex. Mark was in the middle, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Kara nestled into his side, her skin still warm and slightly sticky, her pregnant belly resting against him. She sighed contentedly, draping an arm over him, her fingers lazily tracing patterns on his chest. Raven moved closer to his other side, her body fitting against him like a puzzle piece. She pressed her face into the crook of his neck, her breath hot against his skin, her dark hair splayed across his shoulder. The three of them, exhausted and satisfied, adjusted to find comfort in each other's closeness. Raven's leg hooked over Mark's, her skin slick against his. Kara's hand found Raven's, their fingers intertwining over Mark's torso, a silent acknowledgement of their shared intimacy. As the adrenaline of their lovemaking faded, a peaceful quiet settled over them. Their breathing synchronized, the room filled with the soft sounds of their exhales. Mark felt the weight of both women against him, their warmth seeping into him, calming him. With each passing moment, their movements slowed, eyelids growing heavy. Kara's head rested more firmly against Mark's shoulder, her breathing deepening. Raven's lips parted slightly, her breath tickling Mark's neck as she drifted towards sleep. Mark closed his eyes, a smile on his face, as he wondered how he had gotten so lucky. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, and Mark slowly blinked awake, warmth pressing against his side. Kara had curled into him at some point during the night, her arm draped over his chest, one leg hooked over his. Her breath was slow and steady, her golden hair spilling across the pillows. He smiled, leaning down to press a gentle kiss against her cheek. She stirred slightly, mumbling something incoherent before nuzzling closer to him. Carefully, Mark untangled himself from her embrace, slipping out of bed without disturbing her. He stretched his arms above his head before rolling his shoulders, feeling a few pops along his back. Scratching his head, he made his way downstairs, the scent of breakfast filling the air before he even reached the kitchen. When he stepped inside, he found Raven at the stove, effortlessly managing two tasks at once, flipping eggs with one hand while nursing Waylon at her melon with the other. She looked calm, her violet eyes briefly flicking toward Mark as he walked over to her. "Morning," he murmured, wrapping his arms around her from behind and pressing a kiss to her temple before turning his attention to his son. "And good morning to you too, little guy." Waylon squirmed slightly, making a tiny noise that wasn't quite a cry but wasn't far from one. Mark grinned and brushed a finger across his tiny hand, feeling his son's grip instinctively latch onto him. "Did you sleep well?" Raven asked, glancing at him over her shoulder. "Like a baby," Mark replied as he took a seat around the kitchen island. Raven hummed as she continued cooking, shifting Waylon slightly to get more comfortable. After a few moments of quiet, she finally asked, "So, why were you so late yesterday?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Ended up helping out in Gotham." Raven's brow raised slightly. "Helping how?" Mark exhaled through his nose, rubbing the back of his neck. "I was at the mall when some idiots tried to rob the place. Things escalated, Batgirl showed up, and I ended up helping." He picked up a spoon from the counter and absent-mindedly twirled it in his fingers. Turns out Batgirl is Barbara Gordon, and I said to her I'd help out around Gotham some more. Crazy that Batgirl turned out to be Barbara. Raven didn't even blink. Naturally. Mark narrowed his eyes. You knew. Of course. Why didn't you tell me? Why would I? She said simply. You never mentioned you knew a Barbara. Mark groaned, leaning forward and resting his forehead on the cool surface of the kitchen island. I suppose so. Raven shifted slightly, adjusting her hold on Waylon. So, tell me about this helping in Gotham. Mark grumbled into the counter. I said I'd cover for her until she's fully recovered. There was a brief silence, then a soft giggle. Mark's head shot up, his eyes narrowing at Raven, who was still wearing her usual neutral expression as she spooned eggs onto a plate. Did you just laugh? No, she said flatly. Mark squinted. Are you sure? Because it really sounded like, breakfast is ready, she interrupted smoothly, placing a plate in front of him. Mark shook his head, muttering something about smart-ass wives before picking up his fork. As he ate, he glanced at Raven. How was dinner with the Kents? Raven sat across from him, gently rocking Waylon now that he had finished feeding. Nicer than I expected. Mark smirked. See? Told you there was no reason to be nervous. I wasn't nervous, Raven said, her tone just a bit too defensive. Mark chuckled as he continued eating. Before he could finish his plate, heavy footsteps sounded down the stairs, followed by a dramatic groan. Kara waddled into the kitchen, her hands cradling her round belly. Seriously, no one woke me up, she complained, shuffling over to Mark before wrapping her arms around his shoulders from behind. She rested her chin on his shoulder, her belly pressing against his back. Mark smiled and patted her hand. You looked peaceful. Didn't want to wake you. Kara groaned, I feel so pregnant today. Must be the father's thick head. Not looking forward to pushing that out. Kara huffed. This baby better not ruin my figure, or I'm kicking your butt. Mark let out a short laugh. Pretty sure that won't happen. It better not, she grumbled. At her words, Raven cast a brief glance down at her own stomach, subtly checking for any imperfections. Kara sighed, finally pulling back and stretching. Oh right, Pa Kent asked if you could take a look at the harvester. It's been acting up. Mark swallowed the last bite of food before nodding. I'll head over after I shower. Thank you, hun. Kara smiled and leaned down, pressing a quick kiss to his lips, before sneakily pulling his plate away and taking a bite for herself. Mark raised an eyebrow but chuckled, kissing the top of her head. Guess I'm heading out early. He turned to Raven, leaning in and kissing her as well before heading upstairs. He stripped down, stepping into the shower and letting the hot water ease the tension in his muscles. It was a short shower, no time to relax when there was work to do. Once he was done, he dried off, got dressed, and headed out. Walking across the farmland, he spotted the old harvester sitting near the edge of the field, right where Jonathan Kent had said it would be. He could already tell from a glance that something was off. The machine looked fine on the outside, but the way it sat, slightly uneven, told him there was something wrong with the mechanics underneath. He walked past the harvester and headed up to the Kent house and knocked on the door. Mark stepped up onto the porch of the Kent house and knocked on the door. Within seconds, the sound of footsteps approached, and when the door swung open, he was immediately greeted by the warm, familiar smile of Martha Kentucky. Mark dear, it's so good to see you. Martha beamed, reaching out to take his hands in hers. Come in, come in. You're up bright and early. Have you eaten yet? I just made some biscuits, and I could whip up some eggs in no time. Mark chuckled at her energy, shaking his head. I appreciate it, Mrs. Kent, but I ate before coming here. Martha's smile didn't falter. Well, at least let me get you something to drink. You must be thirsty after flying all the way here. Mark knew there was no point in arguing. That'd be great, thanks. She ushered him inside, leading him through the cozy farmhouse. The place smelled of fresh bread, coffee, and a hint of lavender from the bouquet sitting on the counter. As they entered the kitchen, Mark spotted Jonathan Kent at the table, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he flipped through the newspaper. He looked up when they entered, setting the paper down with a knowing smile. "Morning, son," Jonathan greeted, standing up and offering a firm handshake. Mark took it, feeling the strength in the older man's grip. Despite his years, Jonathan Kent was still built like a man who had spent his life working the land. "Kara told me you'd be stopping by. Said you might be able to help with the harvester." Mark nodded as Martha handed him a glass of cold iced tea. "Yeah, she mentioned it was giving you trouble." Jonathan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Been on its last legs for a few years now, but I think it's finally given out. I've been saving up for a new one, but those damn things are worth a small fortune. I tried to get old Henry to come take a look, but his daughter hasn't been too well recently," he added. Mark took a sip of the tea, nodding as he set the glass down. "I'll take a look at it." "No problem." Jonathan smiled in appreciation. "I'd sure appreciate that." "I'll take you over." "Oh no you don't," Martha interjected, hands on her hips. "You sit right back down and finish your breakfast first." Jonathan sighed but obeyed, shaking his head with a small chuckle as he sat back down. "She's been bossing me around like this for 40 years, you know." "And you love every second of it," Martha quipped back, placing a plate in front of him before giving Mark a knowing smile. Mark chuckled as he watched them. It was rare to see a marriage that had lasted this long and still had this much warmth to it. He leaned back against the counter, sipping his drink and waiting while Jonathan finished his meal. Eventually, when Jonathan was done, he led Mark outside toward the fields. The morning sun was bright but not too harsh, the fresh air carrying the faint scent of soil and grass. "So," Mark started as they walked, "what's the secret?" Jonathan glanced at him. "Secret to a long, happy marriage," Mark clarified. "You and Mrs. Kent seem solid." Jonathan smiled. "Patience, understanding, and knowing when to let her be right even when she's not." Mark chuckled. "Sounds about right." They reached the harvester, a massive rust-colored machine that looked like it had seen better days. Mark walked around it, scanning it before crouching down. Jonathan stood beside him, arms crossed. "How's it look?" Mark lay on his back, scooting under the machine. As soon as he did, something clicked. His mind instantly broke the harvester down into its individual components, visualizing them in perfect 3D images in his head. Every bolt, every gear, every wire. He could see how it all fit together, how each part interacted, how the engine should function. It was a strange sensation, something he still wasn't fully used to. His old self would have had no idea what to do here. Before everything, before viltrumite blood, before the war, before everything, he couldn't even fix a damn bike. Now, he could take apart and rebuild an entire engine in his head as easily as breathing. He spotted the problem almost instantly. A few key components in the fuel intake had rusted through, and a couple of the hydraulic connections were leaking. Simple fixes. He reached out, adjusting a few pieces, letting his fingers move almost instinctively as he reconnected the damaged sections. "So," Jonathan spoke up while Mark worked, "how's living with Kara and Raven?" Mark, still tightening a bolt, shrugged. "Good." Jonathan chuckled. "That's good to hear. A lot of men your age would be terrified of that kind of commitment. A wife, a baby." Mark adjusted another piece, wiping some grease off his hand. "I was scared at first, but I never could have left them. I love them too much." Jonathan nodded, looking out over the fields for a moment. "That's good, son." There was a brief silence before Jonathan sighed. "Truth be told, I was a little concerned when Kara told me about your little arrangement." Mark slid out from under the harvester, sitting up as he dusted off his hands. "Understandable. I wouldn't want the same if I had a daughter." "Yeah," Jonathan admitted. "But I do understand. You were under some strange circumstances. What I'm trying to say is, I'm glad Kara is with someone like you." Mark stood up, nodding at him. "I appreciate that." He turned toward the harvester, flipping the ignition switch. The engine rumbled to life, smooth and steady, no signs of struggle. Jonathan's eyes widened in pleasant surprise, a grin forming as he placed his hands on his hips. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, stepping closer. "I haven't heard it purr like that in years." As Jonathan admired the now working machine, Mark felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from Barbara. Asterisk location attached. "Get here ASAP." Asterisk. Mark sighed, already feeling the weight of responsibility settling on him again. He slid the phone back into his pocket and turned to Jonathan. "Looks like I'm being called in," Mark said. "Tell Martha I said goodbye, yeah?" Jonathan gave him a knowing nod. "Go do what you gotta do." Mark stepped back, cracked his neck, then shot off into the sky, the wind roaring past him as he angled toward Gotham. Mark moved through the sky at speeds that made commercial airliners look like they were standing still. The lights of Gotham grew larger beneath him. He pulled out his phone mid-flight, checked the location Barbara had sent, and adjusted course. His brow furrowed as he neared his destination. Wayne Manor. He slowed down, hovering above the massive estate. Everyone in Gotham knew this place. It was the Wayne Manor, home to Bruce Wayne, billionaire, tech mogul, and general rich bastard from what Mark had heard. Then something clicked in his head. Barbara was Batgirl. She was here. But as far as he knew, Barbara had no personal connection to Bruce Wayne. And yet she was here, of all places. Add that to the fact that Bruce Wayne was around the same height and build as Batman, who had disappeared around the same time Bruce Wayne stepped back from the public eye. Mark narrowed his eyes. That bastard is Batman. It was the only explanation that made sense. His mind quickly pieced together everything. The secrecy, the way Batman moved and fought, the resources he clearly had access to, the insane tech, the way Gotham's entire underworld was terrified of one guy in a bat suit. Bruce Wayne was Batman. It was so obvious now that Mark wanted to smack himself for not seeing it earlier. Floating down toward the grand entrance, he landed lightly in front of the massive wooden doors and pressed the doorbell. It took a few minutes, but eventually, the door swung open, revealing an older man dressed in a tailored black suit. He was balding, though his remaining silver hair was neatly combed back, and his face was lined with age and experience. His posture was straight, his eyes sharp. He wasn't just some butler. This guy had been through some shit. "Good morning, Master Grayson," the man said in a refined English accent. Mark noticed how he winced slightly when he said the name, though he didn't understand why, as he'd never met the man. Hey, mister." "Alfred Pennyworth," the man introduced himself. "You may call me Alfred for simplicity's sake." Alfred stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "Miss Barbara said to expect you. Please come in." Mark followed him into the manor, taking in the absurdly luxurious interior. Everything about this place screamed old money. Expensive paintings, finely polished wood floors, a massive chandelier overhead. It was all a bit much. Alfred led him through the halls. And as they neared a large study, Alfred suddenly stopped and turned to face Mark. His expression was unreadable, but there was an unmistakable weight in his gaze. "Miss Barbara has vouched for you, which is the only reason I am extending you this level of trust," Alfred said calmly. "You will see things that are not meant for the outside world. I ask that you do not betray that trust." Mark crossed his arms. "I wouldn't do that. She's my friend." Alfred studied him for a moment before nodding. "I see." Without another word, he turned and walked toward an old grandfather clock positioned against the wall. He reached behind it, pressed something, and with a quiet click, the clock swung open, revealing a hidden staircase descending into darkness. Mark raised an eyebrow. A secret entrance behind a clock? That's a bit cliché. Alfred smirked faintly. Some traditions are worth keeping. Mark followed him down. As they descended, the air grew colder, the walls shifting from polished wood to raw stone. The deeper they went, the more the space opened up until they finally emerged into a massive underground cavern. Mark stopped, his eyes widening slightly. The Bat Cave. It was a lot. The entire space was dimly lit, the glow of computer screens casting eerie blue light across the stone walls. A massive central console dominated the room, its screens displaying city maps, surveillance footage, and crime reports in real time. Along the walls were rows of armored suits, each with slight variations in design. There were vehicles, a freaking tank, and enough gadgets to make the military jealous. The ceiling stretched high, natural rock formations blending seamlessly with reinforced structures. Water dripped in the distance, the faint hum of servers filling the cavernous space. Alfred led him toward the central computer, where Barbara sat, her fingers flying across the keyboard. When she noticed them approaching, she quickly got up and rushed over. Mark barely had time to react before she threw her arms around him in a tight hug. "I'm glad you're here." Mark returned the hug, a small smile forming. "I promised, didn't I?" Barbara pulled back, smiling up at him. Mark hadn't realized how much he'd missed seeing that smile. "Come on," she said, grabbing his arm. "I'll give you a quick tour." She walked him through the cave, pointing out various things: the bat computer, the vehicle bay, the training area. He listened, nodding occasionally, but his attention kept drifting back to the suits lined up along the walls. Eventually, after the tour, Mark turned to her. "So, what exactly am I supposed to be doing? Just going out on patrol, or what?" Barbara hesitated, rubbing the back of her neck. "Well, there's been a slight change of plans." Mark narrowed his eyes. "Barbara, listen. It's not bad," she said quickly. "I just need you to do something a little extra." Mark folded his arms. "Aha. It's not bad, I promise," she insisted. Mark sighed. "What is it?" Barbara hesitated again, then finally said, "I need you to pretend to be Batman." Mark stared at her blankly. "What the hell?" Barbara winced. "Okay, listen, no, Mark interrupted. "What the hell?" Barbara raised her hands defensively. "Look, Gotham's been getting worse since Batman disappeared. The fear he put in criminals? It's fading. They're getting bolder." "Get him back," Mark said flatly. "I tried," Barbara snapped. "Try harder," he shot back. "I am," she said through gritted teeth. "But in the meantime, I don't want Gotham to fall apart." Mark exhaled through his nose. "So what, you want me to put on the suit, run around, and pretend I'm him? Just keep my powers on the down low and act like Batman?" "Exactly," Barbara said with a grin. Mark pinched the bridge of his nose. "Jesus Christ." "It's not a big deal," she insisted. "You just need to keep up the illusion and stop crime. It's easy." Mark let out a long sigh. He already agreed to help out. This wasn't that much different. And as much as he wanted to argue, she had a point. Gotham needed the symbol of Batman. "Fine. I'll do it." Barbara squealed and immediately hugged him again, pressing a quick kiss to his cheek. "You are the best." Mark groaned, but didn't push her off. Barbara grabbed his hand and practically dragged him over to the costume cabinets. She gestured toward them. "Pick one. Luckily, you and Bruce are around the same size." Mark looked over the suits, but he wasn't exactly thrilled about wearing one of Bruce's old outfits. Then an idea hit him. "Eve," he thought. "Yes, Mark." The AI responded instantly. "Can you emulate these costumes, but make them more combat-oriented and sleeker?" Scanning. There was a brief pause before Eve responded. "Scan complete. Emulating design." Mark felt the nanites shift over his skin, spreading out and forming into something new. Within seconds, a sleek, armored batsuit materialized over his body. The design was modernized, sleek, tactical, with reinforced plating in key areas. The cowl formed seamlessly, sharp yet streamlined, and the cloak draped naturally over his shoulders. Barbara took a step back, her eyes wide. "Holy shit." Mark glanced down at himself, flexing his fingers. The suit felt natural, light yet durable. "Well," he muttered, "I guess I'm Batman now." Barbara practically vibrated with excitement as she circled around Mark, her eyes darting over every inch of the suit. "Okay, first of all, holy shit. Second of all, what is this? How does it work? Is it metal? Is it fabric? It looks like a composite blend, but wait, does it have a built-in AI? Can it change form? Is it pressure resistant? Can it withstand armor-piercing rounds? What about extreme temperatures? How strong is it compared to the actual batsuits? What's the power source? Oh my god, this is insane. Mark held up a hand, trying to get a word in, but she wasn't slowing down. Does it have active camouflage? How does it integrate with your nervous system? Does it boost your reaction time? Wait, how the hell did you even get something like this? This is way beyond anything I've seen, even from Bruce's R&D department. Barbara. Mark finally snapped, rubbing his temple. Jesus, slow down. Barbara blinked, finally stopping herself. Right. Okay. Sorry. But, explain. Mark sighed. It's Cold Eve. A nanosuit I got from the underground auction. Barbara folded her arms. And where exactly in the auction did you get a full-body nanotech exosuit? Mark's jaw tightened for a second, the memories of that night flickering through his mind. I got it from Harley. I'm not sure where she got it. It looked different then. It was after my fight with the Joker. I was dying, and Eve merged with me to keep me alive. Barbara frowned slightly. So you have nanobots in your bloodstream? Mark shrugged. I guess so. He lifted his arm, flexed his fingers, and then shifted them. The nanites responded instantly, his hand dissolving into a sleek, curved blade. Barbara's eyes widened. That is so cool. She reached out, inspecting the edge of the weaponized limb. Is it vibrating at a micro level? It has to be if it's this sharp. I bet, Mark sighed. Focus, Barbara. You can geek out later. She flushed slightly, pulling back. Right. Sorry. Mark let the nanites shift back, reforming his hand before flexing his fingers. Barbara quickly ushered him over to the bat computer, grabbing a small earpiece from the desk. All right, she said, placing it in his hand. This will let me stay in contact with you. I'll monitor the city and let you know if anything big happens, but otherwise, you're free to handle whatever petty crime you find. Mark nodded, securing the earpiece before glancing around the cave. His eyes landed on something near the center of the platform, a sleek black beast of a vehicle, all reinforced plating, aggressive angles, and sheer power. The Batmobile. Mark smirked. He'd be lying if he said he never wanted to drive it. As a kid, it had been the car, untouchable, legendary. And now? Now he had the perfect excuse. He turned and casually started making his way toward it. Barbara squinted. Where do you think you're going? Mark glanced over his shoulder. Gotta get around somehow. Can't exactly fly, can I? Barbara's eyes narrowed. Oh no. No. You're not taking the Batmobile. Mark gestured at himself. I am Batman now, aren't I? Barbara scoffed. Yeah, but you can't just take it. Bruce would lose his mind if he found out. Mark smirked. Bruce isn't here. Barbara crossed her arms. He will be eventually, and when he gets back, he will kick your butt. Mark shrugged. I'll take my chances. Barbara groaned. You are such a pain in the butt. Mark turned back to the Batmobile. Mark, seriously? Mark looked at her again. Barbara. Barbara clenched her jaw. Mark. They stared at each other for a long moment, tension thick in the air. Then Barbara sighed, rubbing her face. Fine. But if Bruce comes back, I'm blaming you. Deal. Grumbling, she walked over to the console and punched in a code. Okay, the activation sequence is, she rattled off a long string of numbers, and the Batmobile's dashboard lit up in response. Don't break it, and don't crash it. I swear to God, if you wreck it, relax, Mark said with a grin. I'll take care of it. She shot him a glare before handing him a utility belt. Take this too. It's got all the standard Batman gear. Grappling hook, smoke pellets, batarangs, rebreather, all that. Mark slung it around his waist, laughing. Man, this is actually kind of fun. Barbara muttered something under her breath. shaking her head. Without waiting any longer, Mark slid into the Batmobile's cockpit, the seat molding around him perfectly. The controls were complex but intuitive, and with a few quick taps, the entire vehicle roared to life. The engine's deep growl echoed through the cave, sending vibrations up through his seat. He grinned. Oh yeah, this was gonna be fun. Barbara folded her arms, still watching. Just don't do anything stupid. Mark winked. No promises. And with that, he slammed the accelerator. The Batmobile launched forward, tires screeching as it shot down the underground tunnel and toward Gotham. It had been a week since Galatea blew Waller apart and freed herself from that damn kryptonite explosive buried in her skull. A week since she stopped being someone else's weapon. A week since she got her first real taste of freedom. She spent the first few days doing everything she'd never been allowed to do, indulging in the things that had been denied to her since the moment she was born. She ate whatever she wanted, tried every single thing she could find. Rich cuts of steak dripping with butter, stacks of syrup-drenched pancakes, seafood fresh from the ocean, the spiciest dishes she could find just to feel the burn. Every flavor, every texture, everything beyond the bland, processed rations they used to feed her back at Cadmus. She drank, too. Not that alcohol affected her, but she liked the taste of expensive liquor, the sharp burn of whiskey, the smooth sweetness of aged wine, the bitterness of black coffee brewed from the rarest beans. She dressed in clothes that weren't some damn government-issued bodysuit, dresses that hugged her body, leather jackets that made her feel dangerous, silk lingerie just because she liked the way it felt on her skin. She walked into high-end boutiques, tried on designer shoes, wrapped herself in furs, laughed at the way store clerks stumbled over themselves when they saw her. She explored cities, stood at the top of the Eiffel Tower just because she could, rode a motorcycle at speeds that should have killed her, danced in underground clubs until sunrise. She lived. And now, a week later, she was still doing exactly that. Tonight, she was in one of the most exclusive clubs in the Gotham City, sprawled out on a VIP couch, drinking from an obscenely priced bottle. The air was thick with smoke, the bass so heavy it vibrated through her body as she took another sip. She wore a black dress that clung to her like a second skin, the neckline plunging deep between her melons, showing off a generous amount of cleavage. The dress had high slits up both thighs, revealing her bare skin all the way to her hips, making it clear she wore nothing underneath. Her legs looked even longer in her gold high heels, drawing every eye in the room as she moved, the fabric barely covering her when she shifted. And they watched her. They always did. Old men in tailored suits with thick gold watches, politicians and businessmen who thought their status meant something to her. Young heirs with too much money and too little self-control, licking their lips like they had a chance. Drug lords who owned half the city's underground, their bodies reeking of sweat, alcohol, and the coke still lingering in their sinuses. They leaned in too close, whispered promises of wealth and pleasure, their hands daring to rest on her thigh, her shoulder, her back. She could smell their rotting livers, the poison running through their veins, the stink of desperation clinging to them. They thought money, power, status made them something. They were insects. One tried to slip something into her drink. She grabbed his wrist before he could even blink, twisting until pop. His arm bent the wrong way, his scream cutting through the music. He dropped to his knees, begging, sobbing. The others just watched, a mixture of fear and arousal in their eyes. Another man thought he could grab her from behind, wrapping an arm around her waist like she was some common club girl. She slammed her elbow into his face, felt his nose shatter like glass, his blood splattering onto her dress. She stood, rolling her neck, sighing as she stepped over their bodies. The women in the VIP section watched, some wide-eyed, others smirking. A dark-haired beauty in a red dress that hugged her curves approached with a smile. "Didn't like them?" she asked. "They disgusted me," Galatea replied, her voice dripping with disdain. The woman laughed. "I'd say you made that pretty clear." Galatea smirked. The woman grabbed her hand, pulling her onto the dance floor where the bass was loud, the lights flashing, and bodies moved in a sea of heat and lust. Galatea danced with the woman in red, pressing close, their bodies grinding. The woman's hands went to Galatea's hips, pulling her closer. Galatea pushed her leg between the woman's thighs, grinding until her breathing turned to moans, barely audible over the music. Another woman joined, her arousal evident in her flushed cheeks. Galatea danced with her next, their movements more than just dancing. She whispered something filthy in her ear, then her hand went down the woman's pants, fingers inside her. The woman's eyes closed, her moans lost in the music as she came hard on Galatea's fingers. After some time, feeling the need for something more private, Galatea headed towards the bathroom, pulling one of the women she danced with by the hand. They entered a stall, the door barely shut before Galatea sat on the toilet lid, pulling the woman's head between her thighs. Galatea's moans grew louder, her control slipping as she neared climax. But before she could reach her peak, the door burst open. Security had been alerted by the commotion. "Out. Now!" one of the guards barked, his voice cutting through the haze of lust. Galatea, still in the throes of arousal, was forced to stand, pulling the woman from between her legs. The other woman quickly adjusted her clothes. After the haze was gone, annoyance flooded her mind, and she straightened other dress out before grabbing the security guard and shoving his head down the toilet so hard that it broke. "Where were we?" she said to the girls before kicking her lips. She partied until the early hours, until the sun threatened to rise, and when she finally left the club, she did so without a word. She took a private car to a penthouse suite she had acquired through means that would have given her 10 to 20 years in prison. Inside, she stripped off her dress, throwing it onto a chair before stepping into the shower. The water was hot, almost burning, but she hardly noticed. Steam clouded the large bathroom as she ran her hands over her body, washing away the night's grime. She scrubbed the sweat, the smoke, the stench of men who thought they could claim her. She leaned against the marble wall, eyes closed, letting the water cascade through her hair. Her hands moved over her large melons, feeling the weight of them, her fingers tracing the outlines of her dark buds. She washed her muscular stomach, the lines of her abs clear under her touch. Eventually, she stepped out, drying herself off, her skin still flushed from the heat. She walked naked toward the massive bed, her body glistening. She collapsed onto the silk sheets, her body sprawling, her melons pressed against the cool fabric, legs slightly parted. She didn't need to sleep. As a Kryptonian, her body absorbed solar energy, brimming with power. But she chose to sleep anyway. Because of them. The dreams. She closed her eyes, and instantly, she was somewhere else. Someone else. A man was kissing her. No, kissing Kara. His hands gripped her hips tight, pulling her close, his lips trailing down her neck, his hard body pressed against hers. His voice, his scent, the way his fingers tangled in her hair, it was all so real. She felt every sensation Kara felt, saw everything Kara saw. The pleasure, the heat, the desperate need. She knew this wasn't her memory, that she shouldn't be here. But every time she slept, she slipped into Kara's mind, experiencing what Kara did, craving what Kara craved. And right now, Kara wanted him. Galatea moaned in her sleep, her hands gripping the sheets, body twitching as the memories overwhelmed her mind. These dreams were the highlight of her existence. And she wanted them for herself. Mark stood in line, arms crossed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, eyes flicking between the menu overhead and the people ahead of him. The coffee shop smelled like burnt espresso and too much syrup, and he wasn't even sure why he was here. Habit, probably. Something to do while he waited. He wanted to get into it straight away, but apparently, that wasn't how it worked. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of his headset, barely moving his lips. "I don't get it. Why can't I just go on patrol now?" Barbara's voice crackled in his ear, unimpressed, like she'd had this conversation 100 times before. "Because Batman patrols at night." Mark stared at the back of the guy in front of him, some office worker tapping away at his phone like the world would end if he stopped. "That's stupid. There's still crime during the day." "There is," Barbara said, like she was talking to a particularly slow child. "But it's lower. Daytime is when Bruce deals with league stuff." He scowled, shifting forward as the line inched ahead. "And why does that means I can't?" Barbara sighed, the kind of sigh that carried over calms even through the usual interference. "Because Batman goes out at night. Everyone knows that." Mark clenched his jaw, exhaling through his nose. "Stupid damn rules." It was one thing if Bruce wanted to play the dramatic nocturnal predator, but that didn't mean he had to. The whole point of him being here was to help, wasn't it? The line moved again. He stepped up to the counter, rattled off his order without really thinking about it, paid, and took the cup when it came. He left without saying anything to the barista, taking a slow sip as he stepped out onto the street, the air damp and heavy with the usual Gotham stink of exhaust, wet pavement, and too many people crammed into too little space. What the hell am I supposed to do in the meantime? Barbara didn't even hesitate. Get acquainted with Gotham. Mark stopped walking. Barbara. I grew up here. I know Gotham. His voice was flat, no emotion, just stating the freaking obvious. Then occupy yourself. He let out another long breath, pushing his free hand into his pocket as he started walking again. He downed his drink, then tossed the cup in the nearest trash can, barely slowing down. If he wasn't allowed to do anything yet, fine. He'd find something. Mark turned off the main street, slipping into an alleyway without thinking about it, stepping over a pile of trash and broken glass. He scanned the area, then bent his knees and shot upward, boots scraping brick as he pushed off the wall, clearing the edge of the building in a single motion. He landed on the rooftop without a sound, walking over to the ledge and sitting down, one foot resting on the other knee, the city stretching out in front of him. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through news feeds, checking for anything worth his time. Nothing but the usual bullshit, political scandals, corporate greed, talking heads pretending they gave a shit. The sky flickered red and blue in the distance. He looked up. Police lights. Fire trucks. Sirens wailing, echoing between buildings. He could see smoke rising a few blocks over, the kind that meant something was burning bad. More sirens in another direction. Somebody was running down a side street, two guys chasing after them. This is low crime. He muttered, watching the scene unfold like a bad rerun. It was always like this. Always had been. Gotham didn't change. It didn't get better. Every time it looked like it might, something dragged it right back down. He remembered being a kid, walking home from school, watching some guy get jumped in an alley and just keeping his head down because that was what you did. He remembered hearing gunshots at night and learning to tell the difference between fireworks and a real problem. He remembered Batman throwing himself into the city like he could fix it, like he could carve out something better with enough time, enough effort, enough blood, but it never changed. Mark exhaled sharply, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. He could be in Smallville right now, doing something that mattered. If he was just gonna sit around waiting for nightfall, he might as well go back. There was nothing for him here. He sighed, closing his eyes, rubbing the bridge of his nose. You do not need the Batman costume to do hero work. Mark blinked, looking up. He frowned. What? You simply need to wear something else. He was quiet for a moment, staring out over the city. She had a point. He didn't have to sit here twiddling his thumbs just because Bruce had some theatrical bullshit about patrolling at night. He was already here. Might as well do something. Fine, he said. Can you give me something like the one in the Hall of Justice? Yes. The material formed over him instantly, stretching over his body like it had always been there. It was skin-tight, clinging to him without feeling restrictive. He flexed his fingers, rolling his shoulders, but something was off. He glanced down. The gloves were fingerless. A white domino mask with a glass visor covered his face. He looked at his hands, then down at the rest of the suit. Looks kinda flimsy. It can withstand several hundred blows from yourself, Eve said, her voice edged with something dangerously close to offense. Mark raised a brow. My bad. He clenched his fist, testing the grip, the flexibility. It felt fine. Something bright caught his eye. He looked up, seeing flames licking the side of a building a few blocks away, smoke billowing into the night sky. He tilted his head, watching for a second. I guess I better get to work. Mark shot into the air, the city blurring beneath him as he gained altitude. Flying never got old. It was instinct, second nature, as easy as breathing, but it never stopped being exhilarating. The wind tearing past him, the sheer speed, the weightlessness. cutting through the world unbothered, untouched, like nothing could slow him down. He spun midair, twisting into a roll before righting himself, then pushed forward harder, faster, a shockwave rippling in his wake as he streaked over the Gotham skyline. Wayne Tower passed below him, the massive W casting a shadow over the streets, but he barely glanced at it. He locked onto the fire, closing the distance in seconds, stopping midair above the burning apartment, the heat rolling off the building in waves, smoke pouring into the sky. Eve scanned the building. How many people are still inside? Scanning now. The visor of his mask flickered for a second, subtle lines running over the structure as Eve processed the information. 5 people remain inside. 3rd, 4th, and 5th floors. Mark didn't waste time. He dove, angling straight for the building, smashing through a window without slowing down. Smoke clogged the air, thick and choking, flames crawling up the walls, eating through support beams, weakening the structure. He moved fast, sweeping through the rooms, zeroing in on the signatures Eve had tagged. The first person was slumped against a doorway, barely conscious, coughing into their sleeve. Mark grabbed them, careful, zooming them out before moving on. 2nd and 3rd, huddled in a corner, eyes wide with fear. He scooped them up, holding them tight, maneuvering through the collapsing building, avoiding falling debris, stepping around fire where he could, busting through walls where he couldn't. 4th and 5th, screaming for help on the top floor, flames licking at their heels. He took them both, careful not to crush them with his grip, shielding them with his body as he shot back out through the window, landing in the street, setting them down gently. The second his feet hit the pavement, Eve's voice was in his ear again. Explosion imminent. Blast radius will engulf the crowd. Mark turned, eyes snapping back to the burning building, seeing it before it happened, the way the fire swelled, the pressure shift, the telltale signs of an impending detonation. He moved before it could go off, bringing his hands together, muscles tensing. The explosion ripped outward, fire and force, a wave of heat and destruction meant to consume everything in its path. Mark clapped. The shockwave from his palms tore through the blast, countering it, dissipating the energy before it could reach the crowd. The fire scattered, flames bending backward, momentum reversing, the explosion snuffed out like a candle in the wind. Smoke still poured from the building, embers glowing, but the immediate danger was gone. He floated up, surveying the damage, then exhaled sharply, mimicking what he'd seen Clark do 100 times before. He inhaled, pulling in the hot air, cooling it in his lungs before pursing his lips and blowing. A gust of freezing wind rushed forward, rolling over the building, lowering the temperature, choking out the last of the flames. In seconds, it was over. The fire was gone. The damage was done, but it wouldn't spread. Mark hovered there for a second, watching the last flickers of flame die out. Not bad work, he muttered. The crowd erupted, cheers and applause breaking the silence, people rushing forward, phones out, snapping pictures, recording videos. Reporters shoved their way to the front, shouting questions, their voices overlapping, a mess of demands and inquiries. Mark sighed but lowered himself down, landing lightly, arms crossing as the first microphone was shoved toward him. "Who are you?" one of them asked. "We've never seen you before." "I'm kind of new," Mark said flatly. "Are you with the Justice League?" "Not really." "Do you have a name?" Mark exhaled, glancing at the smoking building, then back at the reporter. He thought about it for a second, then shrugged. "Invincible, I suppose." Before they could ask anything else, he shot off into the sky, leaving them behind. Raven sat in the Kent farmhouse kitchen, gently rocking Waylon in her arms, his tiny body warm against her. He was quiet, content, fingers curled into little fists, his breathing soft. Across from her, Kara was downing an entire pitcher of lemonade like she'd been stranded in a desert, gulping it down without stopping for air. "Why is it so hot today?" Kara complained. Raven watched, unimpressed. "Don't you absorb solar radiation?" Kara slammed the now empty pitcher onto the table and wiped her mouth. "Yeah, but it's still hot as hell." Martha chuckled as she placed another pitcher on the table, shaking her head like she'd seen this 100 times before. "Once the baby's born, Your hormones should go back to normal, but then you'll have a whole new set of problems. She sat down across from them, folding her hands in her lap. Clark was a handful when he was little. Sweetest baby, but strong as an ox. Broke his crib twice before we figured out a way to reinforce it. You'll have to keep an eye on yours. Make sure they don't accidentally punch a hole through a wall in their sleep. Kara groaned, pressing her forehead against the table. Great. Super baby-proofing. Exactly what I wanted to deal with. Raven smirked but didn't say anything, adjusting Waylon slightly as he squirmed. The hum of the television filled the background, a news anchor droning on about politics, then a robbery, then something about Gotham. The words barely registered until the footage changed, showing a burning building, smoke filling the sky. A new hero appeared in Gotham tonight, putting out a fire and rescuing trapped civilians. Witnesses described the unknown figure as fast, incredibly strong, and capable of generating powerful gusts of wind. Raven's head snapped toward the screen. The feed cut to a blurry but clear enough shot of Mark hovering above the wreckage, white suit catching the streetlights, mask covering most of his face, but not enough to fool her. She knew immediately. She stood up, reaching across the table, grabbing Kara's arm. Look. Kara lifted her head, eyes narrowing at the screen. The footage replayed, showing Mark flying into the burning building, coming back out with people in his arms, setting them down gently. Then it cut to him floating above the street, clapping his hands together, the explosion dispersing instantly. Then he was in the air again, pursing his lips, freezing the flames out with a controlled gust. The reporter's voice cut back in. When asked about his identity, the hero only responded. The screen jumped to the interview. Mark, arms crossed, looking vaguely annoyed at the attention, saying, "Invincible, I suppose," before taking off. Kara stared for a second, then leaned back in her chair, hands resting on her stomach, a smirk playing on her lips. "I'm going to suck him dry when he comes home," she said, her voice husky with desire. Thinking about Mark out there doing his hero work was turning her on. Raven felt her face heat instantly, glancing toward Martha, but the older woman didn't seem fazed, just sipped her tea with the same patience she always had. Waylon stirred in her arms, oblivious. Raven cleared her throat, trying to push the thought away. Not that she disagreed. Sam stood at the stove, stirring a pot of pasta while Cass chopped vegetables beside her, the knife moving fast, methodical, almost lazy in its efficiency. The kitchen smelled like garlic and basil, the heat from the burner making the already thick Gotham air worse. Sam hated it here. The whole city felt like it was constantly closing in, dirty, loud, heavy. "I hate Gotham," she muttered, nudging the pasta with the wooden spoon. Cass didn't look up, just gave a little nod, acknowledging it without needing to say anything. She didn't much like the place either, but like Samantha, she didn't have anywhere else to go. They were a striking contrast, standing next to each other. Sam, tall and lean, her long red hair in a messy ponytail, her thin vest so tight it outlined her melons perfectly, her shorts so short they might as well have been underwear, barely covering her, showing off her long legs. Cass shorter, her body compact yet powerfully built, her dark hair framing her face, wearing the same revealing outfit, a vest that left her toned abs bare and shorts that hugged her muscular wagon and thighs, leaving little to the imagination in Gotham's summer heat. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional sizzle from the stove, the sound of the knife against the cutting board. For a second, it was peaceful. Then, that bastard. "I knew it." Harley's voice cracked through the silence like a gunshot. Sam didn't flinch. Cass didn't either. Sam sighed. "Just ignore her. She's probably watching Midsummer Murders again." Cass nodded, completely unbothered, still dicing onions like nothing had happened. A beat of silence. Then the sound of Harley clearing her throat. Loudly. They ignored it. Then she did it again, even louder, dragging it out obnoxiously. Still ignored it. The kitchen door exploded open, the handle slamming into the wall. "Why the hell are you ignoring me?" Harley demanded, standing in the doorway, hands on her hips, half-feral grin in place, blonde pigtails bouncing as she stomped forward. Sam didn't turn right away, just finished stirring, exhaling slowly. Then she glanced over her shoulder. "Quiet, or you'll wake the baby." Harley huffed, but her eyes flicked down to the bundle in her arms. The tiny body nestled against her chest. Lucy Quinzel, her baby, Mark's baby, was wide awake, chubby little hands waving, babbling furiously, her tiny face scrunched up like she was just as outraged as her mother. Harley laughed, bouncing her gently. "See? My little Lulu agrees with me. Ain't that right, pumpkin?" Sam rubbed her temple. "What is it, Harley?" Harley didn't answer, just grabbed Sam's wrist and dragged her toward the living room. Cass followed silently, still holding the knife. The TV was on, the news blaring, a reporter standing in front of a burned-out building, shaky footage playing behind her, smoke, fire, and then a white-suited figure flying in, grabbing people, pulling them to safety, then floating in the air like he had all the time in the world. "That's Mark," Harley shouted, pointing at the screen like it had personally offended her. "I told you he was alive. He thinks he can just disappear, dodge child support, and not take responsibility? Oh, I don't think so, Busta." The footage replayed, showing him clapping his hands together, canceling out the explosion before it could reach the crowd. Then the freeze breath, the fire dying instantly. Then him hovering above the wreckage, arms crossed, looking vaguely irritated as reporters shouted questions at him. "What's your name?" one of them asked. Mark, completely uninterested, just shrugged. "Invincible, I suppose." Then he shot off, leaving them in the dust. "Oh, he's gonna need to be invincible when I get my hands on him," Harley said as she shook her head with Lucy babbling as well. Cass stared at the screen a little longer than she needed to, feeling a faint warmth creep up her neck, though she kept her expression blank. It wasn't just seeing him again, it was the memory. Sharp, vivid, undeniable. How he'd had Harley first, then Killer Frost and her right after. How neither of them could move by the time he was done. She swallowed, pushing it back down, keeping her face neutral. Sam's reaction was harder to pin down. She didn't blush, didn't look away, just stood there, arms crossed, watching the screen with an expression she hadn't fully figured out yet. Mark had killed her, had ripped her apart, but he'd also set her free. The way she saw it, both were true. Either way, she'd be interested in seeing him again. Harley was already moving, spinning toward the door. "Come on." Sam frowned. "Go where?" Harley shot her a look like it was obvious. "Where else? To get my damn child support." Then she was gone, marching out the door, Lulu giggling in her arms, like this was the best idea in the world. Mark spent the next few hours tearing through Gotham. Helping put out the fire wasn't the only thing that needed doing in this cesspool of a city. There were likely lots of other situations that needed his attention, and he'd deal with them. He was hovering above a side street when he caught the first one. A mugging, a guy in a hoodie pressing a knife into some woman's back, hissing at her to shut up and hand over her bag. She was shaking, fumbling with the strap, the guy getting impatient, jerking it roughly. Mark dropped fast, boots hitting the pavement behind him before he even noticed. The guy spun, eyes going wide. "The hell?" Mark grabbed the knife, crushed it in his palm, then shoved him against the wall. "Try again." The guy struggled, then saw the way Mark wasn't even breaking a sweat, and stopped. Mark glanced at the woman. "You good?" She nodded, clutching her bag like it was a lifeline. "Go home." She didn't need to be told twice. Mark turned back to the guy, still pinned. "Get a job." Then he slapped the guy lightly against the face, knocking him out. That was one. Next, a car chase. Cops already behind it, sirens blaring, but they weren't keeping up. Some sedan, probably stolen, swerving through traffic, nearly hitting pedestrians. Mark caught up in less than a second, flew ahead, then stopped in the middle of the road. The driver saw him too late. Slammed on the brakes. Tires screamed, smoke curling up, but Mark didn't move. The car slammed into him, but the metal curved inwards and the airbags activated inside the car. The guys inside were yelling, trying to reverse. Mark grabbed the hood with one hand and lifted. The back tires came off the ground. The driver floored it, but the car wasn't moving anymore. Mark sighed, flipped it onto its roof, then let the cops handle it. Another one down. Then there was the crane. Some construction site in Midtown, workers yelling, scrambling as the metal structure groaned, the whole thing coming down. Mark saw it before it fully tipped, moved before anyone could react, got underneath it, hands bracing as it collapsed. The weight pressed down heavy, but nothing he couldn't handle. He pushed back, stabilizing it, letting the workers get clear, then snapped the supports back into place, twisting the bent metal into something functional again before flying off. More. A truck flipped on one of the bridges, people screaming, stuck in their cars, honking as fire spread from the wreck. Mark landed, ripped the driver's side door off, pulled the guy free, then did the same for the other car that had been caught in the crash. He then drew in a big breath and put out the fires again just as easily as he'd done before. Then the hostage situation. Some convenience store, 3 guys inside, ski masks, guns. Clerk held at gunpoint while the others emptied the register. Cops were outside, trying to negotiate, but Mark just walked in. The first guy saw him, raised his gun. Mark blurred forward, crushed the gun in his grip, then backhanded him into the shelves. The second guy turned, but Mark grabbed his face and slammed him into the counter before he could do anything. The third guy grabbed the clerk, gun pressed to his head. "Don't move, man. I swear I'll..." Mark was already in front of him, hand around the barrel. He squeezed, metal crumpling. The guy let go of the clerk. "I'm glad you understand," Mark said before flicking his forehead and launching him into the wall behind him. The clerk stood there, breathing hard. "You all right?" Mark asked. He nodded, too stunned to say anything. Mark left before the cops could get inside. Then the firefight. A gang shootout in the Narrows, bullets flying, people ducking for cover, some poor bastard already caught in the crossfire, bleeding out on the sidewalk. Mark hit the ground hard, the impact shaking the street. He walked forward, bullets bouncing off him, gunfire stopping as both sides realized their weapons weren't doing shit. One guy tried to run. Mark blurred in front of him, grabbing his rifle and snapping it in half. "Enough." His voice cut through the street. Then in the blink of an eye he pulled their weapons from their hands, using his gravitational powers, and then easily knocked them all out before giving the police a call. And just like that, the fighting was over. By the time the sun started to set, he could feel the city shifting, winding down into something different. Gotham at night was another beast, something darker. He landed on top of a high-rise, watching the horizon as the last of the daylight disappeared, rolling his shoulders, stretching his fingers. Then the headset clicked. "I'm glad you had fun," Barbara's voice came through dry, a little amused, "but it's time to get to work." About time. The city never slept. Gotham streets were alive with crime, filth, and desperation. It was a perfect hunting ground for those who thrived in the dark. And now, for the first time in months, they were being hunted again. Mark stood on the edge of a rooftop, the bat symbol on his chest glowing faintly under the streetlights, his cape shifting slightly in the wind. The new suit Eve had built was more than just armor. It was a second skin, seamless and silent. He flexed his fingers, feeling the reinforced gloves respond perfectly. This wasn't some heavy, clunky bat suit. This was his. Barbara's voice crackled in his ear. "How's it feel?" Mark sighed under the cowl. "Like I'm wearing a bat costume in a city full of psychos. Feels about right." Barbara chuckled. "Well, you look the part. I gotta say, you're better at this than I thought." Mark leaped from the rooftop, landing silently on the fire escape below. "I don't do anything halfway." "Well, it's working. Just stopped another mugging a few blocks from you." Words already spreading. "They're scared, Mark. They think Batman's back." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Below, a small-time gun deal was going down in a back alley. 5 men, 3 buyers, 2 sellers. One of them, a scrawny guy with a rat face, nervously glanced around as he held up a pistol. "These are fresh. Military grade. You got the cash." One of the buyers, a thick-necked bastard with tattoos up his arms, nodded and handed over a briefcase. "All there." Mark dropped down behind them, silent as death. "Yo, what the F?" He slammed his fist into the tattooed man's face, feeling the crunch of cartilage as the guy's nose shattered. Before the others could react, Mark twisted, driving his boot into another's knee, snapping it sideways. The man screamed as he collapsed, but Mark was already moving. The rat-faced guy tried to pull his gun, but Mark caught his wrist, twisted, and dislocated his elbow in one smooth motion. The scream barely left his throat before Mark slammed his head into the brick wall. The last two panicked, one scrambling for his gun, the other reaching for a knife. Mark stepped forward, grabbed the gunman's wrist, and crushed the bones in his hand with a single squeeze. The man howled, dropping the weapon, but Mark wasn't done. He grabbed the guy's collar, lifted him, and slammed him down onto the pavement hard enough to knock him out cold. The last one, knife in hand, was frozen in place. His whole body shook as he stared at the bodies around him. And no, you're not supposed to be here. They said you were gone. Mark stepped toward him, his cape billowing slightly. They were wrong. The guy turned to run. Mark fired his grapple line, snagging the back of his jacket and yanking him backward. The man hit the ground hard, the knife skidding away. Barbara's voice crackled in. That was clean. Quick, brutal, efficient. Bruce would almost be proud. Mark exhaled through his nose. Next target. She pulled up another report. Robbery in progress. High-end jewelry store. 2 hostages. 4 gunmen. Masked. On it. He launched himself into the air, grappling across buildings. He rushed across the tops of the buildings, allowing himself to use a fraction of his enhanced abilities, which pushed him beyond superhuman level. He slid under vents, jumped across buildings, and used his cape to glide and land on a low building. The jewelry store's front window had been smashed, alarms blaring. Inside, 4 men moved quickly, filling bags with expensive watches, diamonds, and anything else they could get their hands on. 2 civilians were on their knees, hands behind their heads, terrified. One of the masked men turned to the hostages. "Shut up and stay down, or I start blowing kneecaps off." Mark landed silently on the roof, crouching by the skylight. He could see everything, every movement, every detail. The leader, the twitchy one, was the most dangerous. His finger rested too easily on the trigger. The others? Hired muscle. Barbara's voice came through. "You have a plan?" "Yeah. Hit him fast. Hit him hard." Classic Mark. Mark smirked. Then he dropped. The first man never saw him coming. He landed on him like a wrecking ball, knocking him unconscious instantly. The second turned, but Mark was already on him, delivering a brutal elbow to the throat before throwing him over the glass counter. The third got a shot off. Mark twisted, the bullet barely grazing his new suit. Before the guy could fire again, Mark grabbed his arm and snapped it at the elbow. The man collapsed, howling in pain. The last one, twitchy trigger finger, grabbed a hostage and pressed the gun to her head. "Back off," he screamed. "I'll do it." Mark stared at him. Silent. Unmoving. The man was shaking. "I swear to God I'll..." Mark took one step forward. The guy panicked, fired. Mark was already moving. He threw a batarang at the man, which sliced off the trigger finger. He then closed the distance in a blink, twisting the gun from the man's grip and slamming his forehead into his face. The man crumpled, blood spilling from his broken nose. Barbara's voice came through. That was quite scary. That was the point. The hostages trembled, staring up at him. You're really back," one of them whispered. Mark didn't answer. He turned, cape flowing behind him as he disappeared into the night. Mark stood on the rooftop, crouched on the edge as he looked out over the city. The streets below were alive with crime. It wasn't even just major incidents like armed robberies or gang violence. Muggings, carjackings, assaults. Everywhere he looked, Gotham was eating itself alive. "This city is a lost cause," he muttered. Barbara's voice crackled in his ear. "Bullshit." Mark sighed. "Come on, Barb. This place is a mess. I've been out here for hours, and it's nonstop. No matter how many guys I put down, there's 10 more waiting to take their place." You think Bruce never thought that? I don't know, maybe he did, but it still feels pointless. Barbara exhaled. It's not pointless. You think about it too big. You're looking at the whole city like you have to fix it. You don't. You're just supposed to hold the line. One night at a time, one crime at a time. You stopped that robbery tonight? That's one less store owner getting put in a body bag. That's 2 people who go home alive instead of bleeding out on the floor. Mark didn't respond right away. He looked down at the city again. I don't know how Batman did this every night. Barbara's voice softened. Because he never focused on the big picture unless he had to. Just the next fight. Mark let that sink in for a second before shaking his head. Still think this city's a dump. Yeah, well, tough shit, Batman. You're in it now. Mark smirked slightly. Any other good news for me? Actually, yeah. A Wayne Tech truck just got hijacked. Loaded with high-end weapons and equipment. GCPD's trying to stop it, but these guys are tearing through them. Mark rolled his shoulders. All right. I'm on it. He pressed a button on his suit, sending a silent signal. Then, without hesitation, he jumped. The wind howled past him as he dropped, his cape billowing behind him. He landed in a crouch directly in the Batmobile, the sleek black machine having arrived just in time. Bruce probably wouldn't be too happy about him having Eve hack the Batmobile's autopilot, but oh well. He gripped the wheel and hit the accelerator. The engine roared, tires screeching against the pavement as he tore through the streets of Gotham. The hijackers were loving this. The truck was a beast, armored, reinforced, and packed with millions of dollars worth of tech. And it was theirs. One of them, a greasy-looking guy with a scar across his lip, was practically giddy. You know how much we're gonna make selling this shit. This is retirement money, boys. The driver laughed. If we don't crash this thing first, you sure you can keep up the speed? Relax, I got it. In the passenger seat, another thug was holding one of the Wayne Tech weapons, a compact energy cannon that was far beyond anything street gangs should have access to. The guy grinned. Check this out. He leaned out of the window and fired a blast at one of the cop cars in pursuit. The bolt of energy slammed into the front bumper, sending the vehicle flipping through the air before crashing into a building. The hijackers cheered. Whoa. Did you see that shit? GCPD ain't got nothing on us. We're untouchable, baby. Then the Batmobile slammed into them, landing next to them from a freeway just above them. The truck lurched violently as the reinforced front of the Batmobile rammed into the back tires, sending sparks flying. The men inside screamed, the entire vehicle rattling from the impact. What the hell? Then they saw it. The Batmobile pulled up beside them, its sleek black frame cutting through the night. Inside, the silhouette of Batman himself. The driver panicked. No, he's gone. He's supposed to be gone. The guy with the energy weapon didn't waste time. He aimed at the Batmobile and fired. Mark jerked the wheel at the last second, dodging the blast as it tore through a parked car. He couldn't afford to take too many hits. Bruce might kill him if he actually damaged this thing. Barbara's voice crackled in. Jesus, these guys are amped. Yeah, and they've got big toys. What's the plan? Mark smirked. I'm gonna take the truck, obviously. You're what? Mark didn't answer. He gunned the accelerator, speeding ahead before cutting the wheel hard, forcing the Batmobile into a drift alongside the truck. Then he leaped. He landed hard on the roof, his boots denting the metal. Inside, the hijackers screamed. He's on the roof. One of them, a burly guy with brass knuckles, scrambled up through the roof hatch, pulling himself onto the top. He rushed Mark, swinging. Mark dodged effortlessly. The guy went for a wild right hook. Mark caught his arm, twisted it, and snapped the elbow joint in one clean motion. The man howled, but Mark silenced him with a brutal headbutt, sending him toppling off the side of the truck. Another one tried to climb up. Mark grabbed the edge of the hatch and slammed it down on his fingers. The man shrieked and fell back inside. Barbara's voice crackled. That was Is he okay? Mark smirked. They'll live. He took a step forward, then jumped. Flipping over the edge of the roof, he smashed feet first through the windshield. The driver barely had time to scream before Mark kicked him out of the seat, sending him crashing against the dashboard. With perfect timing, Mark grabbed the wheel and slammed the brakes. The massive truck screeched, tires smoking as it skidded across the pavement before finally grinding to a halt. Silence. Then, from the comms, Barbara. Okay. That was cool. Mark exhaled. Yeah. It kinda was. After getting out the truck, Mark made sure to contain all of the thugs. He thought about questioning them, considering the fact that there was no way they would have been able to pull something like this off without any support, but in the end he decided to let it go and let the cops deal with him. Mark, I've got something important, it can't wait, Barbara said through their headset. Besides, it looked like he'd be even busier tonight. Mark landed silently on the rusted metal beams high above the warehouse floor, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene below. A dozen men, heavily armed, were stationed around the massive room, surrounding a group of frightened, bound individuals. Women and children, most of them bruised, terrified, and clinging to one another. Human traffickers. The absolute worst kind of filth. Mark's fingers clenched into a fist. This wasn't a simple mugging or a convenience store robbery. This was more evil. The fact these women and children were being sold into what was basically slavery lit a fire in him that burned. These weren't just thugs looking to make a quick buck. These were men who thrived on suffering, who made a business out of treating human lives like currency. Barbara's voice came through his earpiece, hushed, controlled. Mark, be careful. These guys aren't street trash. They're part of a bigger network. I've been tracking their operations for a while, and they have major connections. Doesn't matter, I'll deal with all of them now, Mark muttered, his voice low. He had spent his whole life dealing with people who wanted him dead. This wouldn't be any different. He analyzed the scene quickly, counting each armed man, noting their weapons, their positions. Most were carrying small arms, handguns, a few SMGs, but two stood out. One had a pump-action shotgun strapped to his back, pacing near the captives like a caged animal. The other, clearly the leader, sat at a desk near the back, checking his phone while a rifle rested across his lap. Mark moved. He dropped down behind one of the men standing watch near the loading dock entrance. Before the guy could react, Mark grabbed his head and slammed it into the steel support beam, knocking him out instantly. He also likely cracked open his skull, but he didn't care. He wouldn't feel bad for hurting filth like this. He caught the body before it hit the ground, dragging it into the shadows. One down. He moved fast, taking out two more guards brutally, snapping one's arm before delivering a knockout blow to his temple, then driving his knee into the other's spine before he could even scream. He felt the man's spine snap. He'd never walk again. Good. 3 down. The others were still clueless. Mark crept along the upper scaffolding, narrowing his sights on the man pacing with the shotgun. He timed it perfectly. Just as the guy passed under the catwalk, Mark dropped, wrapping his arms around the man's neck, wrenching him into a chokehold. The guy flailed, tried to fire the shotgun, but Mark twisted his arm and snapped his wrist in one motion before choking him unconscious. 4 down. Then one of the others finally noticed something was wrong. Hey, where's Tommy? One of the traffickers called out, turning in circles, his pistol drawn. Mark moved fast. He surged forward, catching the man by the wrist and twisting it, making him fire a shot into the ground. The sound sent the rest of the thugs into panic mode. Before anyone could react, Mark threw the guy into a stack of crates, knocking him out cold. Then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted. The traffickers scattered, some taking cover behind steel containers, others firing blindly into the shadows. The captives screamed, pressing themselves against the floor. Mark stayed low, weaving through the chaos, using their panic against them. He grabbed a fallen SMG, unloading the clip into the ceiling to send them further into confusion before tossing the weapon aside. He moved to the nearest gunman, dodging a wild swing of a crowbar before delivering a savage uppercut to his chin. Blood and teeth splattered across the ground as the man collapsed. The last two tried to run. Mark wasn't having it. He caught one by the collar, spinning him around before slamming him into a nearby wall so hard it cracked the concrete. The last one, the leader, was making a break for the exit, fumbling with his phone, probably trying to call for backup. Mark was on him in a second. He grabbed the man's wrist and crushed the phone in his grip. The man screamed as Mark lifted him off the ground by his throat, his feet kicking wildly. Please. Please, the man choked out. Why, you don't understand. You're not supposed to be here. Mark's grip tightened. I'm here now. Then he drove his fist into the man's gut, sending him sprawling across the floor in a heap. Barbara's voice came through his earpiece. Holy shit, Mark. That was intense. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as he turned to the group of captives. They stared at him, wide-eyed, trembling. He wasn't exactly comforting in this suit, but at least they weren't dead. You're safe now, Mark said. Cops will be here soon. One of the women nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. Mark said nothing. He turned, disappearing into the shadows, just as sirens filled the night. Barbara's voice crackled again. You still breathing? Yeah, Mark muttered, leaping onto a fire escape. You okay? Mark didn't answer right away. This had felt different than the other fights. He had beaten plenty of people to a pulp before, but these men had deserved worse than what he gave them. But that wasn't the point. I'm fine, he finally said. What's next? Barbara hesitated. You sure? I said what's next, Barbara. A pause. Then gang activity near the docks. Looks like a smuggling operation. Mark sighed. Gotham's just full of great people, huh? Barbara snorted. Oh yeah, a real paradise. The night had been long. Mark had spent hours putting down criminals, stopping robberies, beating the shit out of gangsters, and making sure Gotham still feared the Bat. His movements were calculated, his strikes efficient, his presence terrifying. Just like Bruce. Maybe even better. But now, as he sat perched on a rooftop, overlooking the city, he felt burnt out. Physically, he was fine. Barely a scratch on him. But mentally? His brain felt like it had been wrung dry. The things he'd seen tonight weren't just the typical low-life scum committing basic crimes. Gotham was a horror show. He'd stopped a group of guys dragging a woman into an alley. 6 men against 1, her clothes torn, her makeup smeared from crying, her voice hoarse from screaming for help. He broke them. Hard. One tried to stab him, so he shattered his arm. Another pulled a gun, so he made sure the guy wouldn't walk again. The woman? She didn't even thank him. She just sat there, shivering, hugging her arms around herself. And then there was the kid. A boy, maybe 10 years old, standing over a fresh corpse. His father. Shot in the head for refusing to hand over his wallet. The kid was holding the damn thing, his dad's wallet. Like maybe if he had just given it up faster, his dad would still be breathing. He didn't cry. Didn't scream. Just stood there staring. Empty. Mark had landed too late for that one. Barbara's voice crackled in his ear. You did good tonight, Mark. He exhaled slowly. Yeah. You sound thrilled. He rolled his shoulders. Just another night in Gotham, I guess. There was a pause. Then softer, are you okay? Mark didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure how to. Finally, he muttered, I don't know. Barbara sighed. You should get some rest. Mark reached up, turned off the comms. He was done talking. He was just about to stand when something whipped through the air. His instincts kicked in, and he flipped backward just in time to avoid the strike. As he twisted in midair, he caught a glimpse of what it was. Is that a whip? The moment he landed, another crack sounded. And this time he caught it. His hand snapped forward, gripping the leather mid-strike, and with one hard yank, he pulled the attacker straight out of the shadows and into his grasp. A woman crashed into his chest, and Mark immediately locked an arm around her throat, pinning her. And that's when he got a good look at her. Curves in all the right places, a black leather catsuit that hugged her body like it had been painted on, long legs wrapped in thigh-high boots, a zipper just low enough to tease without giving everything away. Her black mask framed sharp green eyes, and full lips curled into something between amusement and annoyance. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Mark growled. The woman pouted, feigning disappointment. Here I thought the big bad bat finally came out to play, only to find out it's just another boy wonder. Mark scowled and shoved her off him, sending her stumbling back. "I am Batman." She tilted her head, lips twitching in amusement. "Oh, is that so?" Mark stayed silent, watching her. She giggled, placing a hand on her hip. "That might fool the common folk, sweetheart, but not me. I know Batman. Very well." Her smirk faltered slightly, just for a moment. "Or at least, I used to." Mark crossed his arms. "You got history with him? Take it up with him." "That's the problem." She took a slow step closer, moving too gracefully for someone in Gotham's filth. "He's disappeared." Mark didn't say anything. She took another step. "So I'll ask again." Her voice dropped, sultry and slow. "Where is he?" Mark held her gaze. "No clue." She hummed, circling him like a predator. "I don't believe you." "Not my problem." She ran a gloved finger down his arm. "I can be very persuasive, you know." Mark caught her wrist before she could get any further. "Not interested." She sighed dramatically. "Such a shame. You really do look the part. For a second, I almost believed it was him under there." Mark said nothing. Her fingers brushed his jaw, a teasing touch. "If it makes you feel better, you wear the cowl very well." And then, before he could react, she pressed a kiss to his chin. Then she was gone, disappearing into the shadows like she was never there. Mark exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Gotham women are insane. Good thing he'd already disconnected the call from Barbara. The sterile white lights of the watchtower's medical bay hummed softly overhead as Mark sat beside Kara's hospital bed, his fingers idly tracing the back of her hand. She squeezed his palm, clearly trying to stay calm, but he could feel the tension in her grip. Raven sat on the other side of the bed, her violet eyes focused on Kara as she gently rubbed her back. In her arms, she held Waylon, who had just finished feeding and now clutched onto the fabric of her robes, making tiny noises as he dozed. Kara was supposed to have given birth by now. That was what had everyone worried. Kryptonians, from what they knew, had fairly standard gestation periods when compared to humans. If anything, they sometimes gave birth sooner. But here they were, well past her expected due date, and nothing had happened. No labor pains, no contractions. Just waiting. Mark exhaled through his nose, rubbing his thumb against Kara's knuckles. She was trying not to show how anxious she was, but he could see it. It had been creeping up on her for days, the uncertainty, the nagging fear that something was wrong. "Everything's fine, Kara," Raven murmured, running her fingers through the blonde's hair. "The baby's strong. And if something was wrong, we'd know." Kara huffed, closing her eyes for a moment. "I know, she exhaled sharply, pressing her free hand to her belly. "I should have had this baby by now. I don't like this." Mark squeezed her hand, leaning in to kiss her forehead. "We'll figure it out." Just then, the doors slid open, and the watchtower's chief medical officer, Dr. Lang, entered. She was an older woman, gray-haired but sharp-eyed, holding a data pad as she approached the bed. "Well, good news," she said, looking between the three of them. "The tests show that the baby is perfectly healthy. Strong vitals, excellent development, no complications." Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Kara visibly sagged against the bed. Raven, ever composed, simply nodded, but even she seemed relieved. "So what's the holdup, Doc?" Mark asked. Dr. Lang pursed her lips. "Given the baby's mixed heritage, it's possible that the standard gestation expectations don't apply here. Kryptonian, viltrumite, and human DNA all interacting in ways we don't fully understand. The timeline could be slightly different." Kara groaned. "So what?" I could be pregnant for months longer. Dr. Lang chuckled. I doubt it. But I would recommend you stay here on the watchtower for the time being. We have the best medical tech in the system, and if anything does happen, we'll be able to respond immediately. Kara frowned. I don't need to stay here. I'm fine. Mark and Raven exchanged looks. Kara, Raven said, tone firm but soft, we should at least consider it. Mark nodded. It's the safest place right now. I know you don't like being cooped up, but let's not take any risks. Kara looked between them, biting the inside of her cheek, then huffed. Fine. But only because I don't want you two hovering over me more than you already do. Mark grinned, leaning over to kiss her. That's all I ask. Kara rolled her eyes, but there was warmth behind it. Later, as they sat together in one of the watchtower's apartments, the tension from earlier had mostly dissipated. Kara was leaned back in the seat, her hand resting on her belly, Mark beside her with an arm draped around her shoulder. Raven sat across from them, still holding Waylon, rocking him slightly as they talked. So what's the plan after the baby's born? Kara asked, looking over at Mark. He shrugged, thinking about helping Jonathan with the farm for a bit. Kara's eyebrows shot up. You? A farmer? She snorted. I can't picture that. Mark rolled his eyes. I can do manual labor, you know. Oh, I know, but you farming? What, are you gonna start waking up at sunrise and milking cows? Raven chuckled. I'd like to see that. Mark sighed. Look, I just figured it'd be nice to help out. Jonathan's been good to us, and I kinda like the place. It's quiet. Kara smirked. So you're just gonna be a small-town boy now? Mark shot her a dry look. I grew up in Gotham, Kara. A farm is practically a vacation. Kara giggled, leaning into him. Raven tilted her head. And your hero work? Mark exhaled through his nose. Been doing it for over a week now. Apparently, I'm all over the news. As Batman and Invincible, Raven noted. Mark scoffed. Yeah, well, both of those are temporary. Kara hummed. You say that now. Mark shook his head. I've got more important things to worry about. Without another word, he pulled them closer, his hands firm on their waists. Mark left the lounge, stretching his arms over his head as he walked through the watchtower's halls. His hard schlong gladly went away before he crossed paths with anyone, but the frustration he felt from it only seemed to pile on to everything else he was feeling. He'd been at this hero thing a week, and every night he felt burnt out and like he'd made no progress at all. He made his way to the observation deck, stepping into the vast open space where the reinforced glass gave an unobstructed view of Earth. The planet floated below, bathed in the soft glow of the sun, its surface a tapestry of blues, greens, and swirling white clouds. The sight was always something, no matter how many times he saw it. Then he heard a noise behind him and he turned. Superman stood beside him, hands resting on his hips, his cape shifting slightly as he moved. They stood in silence for a while before Clark finally spoke. You've been doing good work. Mark smirked slightly. You keeping tabs on me? Clark chuckled. Not directly, but I see the results. He turned slightly to face him. You've been helping a lot of people, both as Invincible and as Batman. Mark let out a small exhale. Yeah, well, it's been crazy out there. Clark nodded. It always is. Mark shifted, resting his forearms on the railing. Doesn't really matter, though. Clark raised a brow. Why do you say that? Mark gestured vaguely to the planet below. It's just, no matter what we do, people don't stop. I took down a guy trying to mug a woman the other night, snapped his wrist in 3 places. Not even 5 minutes later, another bastard tried to do the exact same thing on the next block over. It's like they don't learn. Clark tilted his head. So what, you think it's pointless? Mark frowned slightly, shaking his head. I wouldn't say pointless, but it's like trying to drain the ocean with a bucket. You stop one crime, 5 more pop up. You save someone today, They're just gonna be in danger again tomorrow. It never ends. Clark sighed, folding his arms. You're right. It doesn't end. Not for us. Mark gave him a sideways glance. And that doesn't bother you? Clark was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. It used to. There were times I felt like I wasn't making any real difference. That no matter how hard I tried, the world would always be broken. Mark huffed. Sounds about right. But then I realized something. Clark turned toward him fully. The world isn't broken, Mark. It's just lost. Mark scoffed. Yeah? Feels pretty broken to me. Clark smiled slightly. Because you're looking at the big picture. But change doesn't happen all at once. It's not about fixing everything. It's about making things better, little by little. Mark frowned. So what, you're saying we just chip away at it forever? Clark nodded. Yes. Because every person we help, every life we save matters. Even if it's just one. Even if it feels small. Mark exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. That's slow. Clark chuckled. It is. But it's the only way that lasts. Mark stayed quiet for a moment, mulling it over. Clark glanced at him. That girl you saved from the traffickers. Do you think she thinks what you did was pointless? Mark clenched his jaw, looking down. No. Then it wasn't, Clark said simply. Mark tapped his fingers against the railing, thinking. I don't know, man. I get what you're saying, I really do, but people are awful. Even the ones we help, half the time they don't even deserve it. Clark sighed. People can be awful, but they can also be better. That's why we do this, to remind them of that. Mark let out a dry chuckle. Man, you're really committed to this hope thing, huh? Clark smiled. Someone has to be. Mark thought about it. Maybe Clark was right. Maybe the world wasn't as hopeless as he thought. Maybe. Guess I'll keep at it a little longer, he muttered. Clark clapped a hand on his shoulder. Good. Mark smirked. Still think you're full of shit, though. Clark laughed. I get that a lot. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, just watching the earth spin below. Then Clark glanced at him. You know, if you need a break, I know a place. Mark raised a brow. Yeah. Clark nodded. There's this little town in France. Not a tourist hotspot, just a quiet, beautiful place. Lois and I go there sometimes when we need to get away from everything. No capes, no villains. Just peace. Mark hummed. Sounds nice. Clark smirked. It is. And I think you'd like it. Mark considered it. Maybe a little peace wouldn't be so bad. The next day, Mark sat with Kara and Raven in their quarters on the watchtower, telling them about his conversation with Clark. He had expected some resistance, maybe even a sarcastic remark from Kara about him taking a vacation, but to his surprise, they were both on board with the idea. You should go, Raven had said simply, holding Waylon close as she rocked him slightly. You've been pushing yourself too hard. Kara, resting against a pillow, had nodded. Yeah, Mark, you've been running yourself into the ground between Gotham and everything else. Take a break. Relax. Who knows, you might actually like not getting shot at for once. Mark wasn't sure about it at first. He still felt like there was too much to do. Staying in Gotham, being here with Kara, waiting for the baby to come. But they had a point. And as much as he hated to admit it, he was tired. So the next morning, after making sure everything was fine with Kara and Raven, he left the watchtower and flew toward France. The moment he arrived, Mark had to admit, Clark picked a damn good place. The small town was nestled deep in the countryside, surrounded by rolling green hills and golden fields of wheat that swayed in the warm breeze. It was the kind of place that looked like it belonged in an old painting, untouched by the chaos of the modern world. The buildings were traditional, old stone cottages with wooden shutters and small gardens overflowing with flowers. Narrow cobblestone streets wound through the town, leading to open-air markets and cozy little cafes where locals gathered, sipping coffee and talking like they had all the time in the world. The air smelled clean, fresh, a mix of baked bread, lavender, and something sweet he couldn't quite place. The entire place felt different from anywhere he had ever been before. No sirens, no gunshots in the distance, no constant tension pressing down on him. Just quiet. Mark landed just outside a small inn that Clark had recommended. It was a rustic little place, family-run, with ivy crawling up the walls and a view of the river just down the hill. The woman at the front desk, a kind old lady with laugh lines and a thick accent, greeted him warmly, handing him the keys to a small but comfortable room with a balcony overlooking the fields. As he stepped out onto the balcony, looking at the endless stretch of countryside before him, Mark exhaled. Maybe this wasn't such a bad idea after all.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.